He holds 300 patents. The entire modern electrical grid runs on his invention. Every time you flip a light switch, charge your phone, turn on a hospital machine that keeps someone breathing through the night, you are using something he built. He died with nothing. Not almost nothing. Nothing. No money. No property. No family nearby. An unpaid hotel bill. A few pigeons on a windowsill. And a collection of notebooks that government agents seized within hours of finding his body. Notebooks that have never been fully released to the public. His name was Nikola Tesla, and if you think you already know his story, you don't. Not really. Most people know the version that fits on a bumper sticker, the tortured genius, the man Edison stole from, the tragic inventor who lost the war of currents and died forgotten. That version is everywhere now. T-shirts, documentaries, Reddit threads, the name of an electric car company worth more than any automaker on earth. But that version leaves out the parts that actually matter. It leaves out the mother who gave him everything and received nothing in return. It leaves out the business partner who may have been the only person Tesla ever truly trusted. It leaves out the tower, the dream of free energy for every human being on the planet, and the single question that destroyed it. It leaves out the years nobody talks about, the last 2 decades of his life, when he was still working, still thinking, still filing patents on technologies the world wouldn't understand for another 50 years, completely alone in a hotel room in New York City, the city he had personally illuminated. It leaves out what was taken from him and who took it. Here is what we actually know. In 1943, on the night of January 7th, a maid at the Hotel New Yorker went to deliver a do not disturb notice to the occupant of room 3327. He had asked not to be disturbed for days. She knocked. No answer. She opened the door. Nikola Tesla was dead in his bed. He was 86 years old. He was wearing his clothes. His hands were folded. On his desk were papers covered in calculations. On his windowsill, the remnants of birdseed. In the corner of the room, boxes of notebooks, blueprints and documents representing decades of work. By the next morning, before his body had even been fully examined, agents from the United States Office of Alien Property had entered that room and taken everything. Everything. The notebooks, the blueprints, the loose papers, the personal documents, all of it classified and removed. Decades later, some of it was returned to Serbia. Some of it was eventually declassified. But not all of it. To this day, there are portions of Nikola Tesla's work that remain sealed. Think about that for a moment. The man who invented AC power, who designed the electrical system that runs the entire modern world, died in a hotel room that he couldn't pay for, and within hours, his government decided that whatever was in those boxes was too important or too dangerous to let the public see. Why? That is the question this story keeps circling back to. Not the question everyone asks, which is how did such a brilliant man end up with so little? That question has a simple answer. The world used him and discarded him the way the world has always treated the people it needs most. The real question is what he actually knew, what he was actually working on in those final years. What was in those boxes that made men in suits arrive before the body was cold? We may never fully know, but tonight we're going to follow his life from the beginning. From a small village in Serbia, on a night when a lightning storm split the sky and a midwife told a mother her newborn son would be a child of light. From that beginning, all the way to room 3327, all the way to the moment the lights went out for the man who had turned them on. Settle in. This is the complete story of Nikola Tesla, and it is nothing like what you've been told. The village of Smiljan barely exists on most maps. It sits in the green hills of what is now Croatia, a small, quiet place where the mountains catch the clouds and the nights in summer arrive slowly, the sky turning from gold to purple to a darkness so complete you can see every star. In the 1850s, it was even smaller than it is now, a scattering of stone houses, a Serbian Orthodox church, fields, animals, the rhythm of a life that had not changed much in centuries. The kind of place the wider world never thinks about. The kind of place that has no reason to be remembered. It would be remembered. On the evening of July 9th, 1856, a storm moved through those hills. Not an ordinary summer storm, the kind of electrical storm that the people of that region still talk about in a particular tone of voice, with a particular look in the eye. The kind of storm that makes you feel the sky is alive. Lightning cracked the mountains. Thunder rolled through the valleys in waves. The air itself seemed charged with something, trembling with a force that had no name in any language spoken in that village. Sometime after midnight, in the early minutes of July 10th, a child was born. His mother, Georgina Tesla, known to everyone as Juka, looked at the window while the lightning continued outside. The midwife, trying to reassure her, said the storm was a sign. This would be a child of the storm, she told her. Juka shook her head. No, she said, he will be a child of light. She was not speaking metaphorically, she genuinely believed it, and she would spend the rest of her life making sure it was true. You have to understand Nikola Tesla before you can understand her son, because almost everything remarkable about Nikola Tesla, the memory, the visualization, the obsessive drive to understand how things worked, came directly from her, and almost nobody knows her name. She could not read, she had never been formally educated. In the Serbia of the mid-1800s, the education of women was not considered important, which was one of the great intellectual crimes of that era, because Nikola Tesla had a mind that would have changed whatever field she'd been permitted to enter. She had memorized the complete works of Serbian epic poetry, thousands of lines. She could recite any of it, on request, at any time, without preparation, without error. Not just the words, but the rhythms, the cadences, the emotional weight of every verse. She had memorized entire books of scripture the same way, the same effortless, total recall that her son would later describe as both his greatest gift and the source of his deepest suffering. She built things when a tool she needed for the household didn't exist. She invented it. Looms, mechanical devices for the farm, small machines that she designed and constructed herself, with no training, no engineering education, no guidance except the internal logic of a mind that simply understood how physical systems worked. She was also deeply mystical. She believed in signs, in the significance of timing, in forces that science had not yet named. She prayed with the same intensity she brought to everything else, completely, without reservation. Nikola Tesla inherited all of it, every single part. His father, Milutin Tesla, was the local Serbian Orthodox priest, a tall, imposing man with a great beard and strong opinions about nearly everything. He wrote poetry, he spoke several languages, he had a memory almost as powerful as his wife's, though he preferred to believe his was superior. He was ambitious, in the quiet, constrained way of a man who had chosen a life that had a ceiling, and he knew it. Milutin wanted his son to become a priest. He had decided this before Nikola could speak. The church was stability, respect, purpose. It was the life Milutin understood. And in the Smiljan of 1856, a father's plans for his son were not considered negotiable. Nikola was the fourth of 5 children. He had an older brother named Dane, 2 older sisters, and a younger sister named Marika. By most accounts, Dane was the golden child. Brilliant, confident, physically capable, the kind of firstborn son who seems to arrive in the world already knowing what it expects of him. Nikola was different from the beginning. He was thin and pale, with grey eyes that people sometimes described as unsettling, eyes that seemed to be looking at something just past whatever was directly in front of him. He was easily frightened as a small child, sensitive to light, sensitive to sound, sensitive to textures, in ways his family found difficult to explain. He would hear a sound that nobody else could hear and cover his ears. He would see something at a distance and describe details that turned out to be accurate when they were later verified up close. And he had the visions. He never used the word hallucinations. He hated that word, spent his whole life pushing back against it. What he experienced, he insisted, was not a disorder, it was a capacity. When his mind was stimulated by a word or an idea, Images would appear, not vague impressions, fully realized, three-dimensional, complete images, with texture and light and movement. A word like river, and he would see a river, specific and real. Every stone visible on the bottom. A mechanical description, and the machine would appear before him, assembled, operating, every part in motion. As a child, he could not control it. The images came whether he wanted them or not, interrupting his waking life with visions so vivid he sometimes could not tell them from reality. He would reach for something he could see clearly in front of him, and his hand would pass through empty air. He would hear voices that assembled from fragments of sound. It terrified him. He would later say that these episodes, which plagued him most severely in childhood, were the thing he was most afraid of. Not the dark, not the storms that the other children feared, but his own mind, the way it produced realities he had not asked for. He didn't tell anyone. He was a child in a small village in the 1860s, and the vocabulary for what he was experiencing didn't exist. There was no framework, so he kept it to himself and learned to live inside it. What saved him, in a way, was books. The Tesla household had a library that was extraordinary for its time and place. Milutin believed in reading with the same conviction he brought to his faith. The shelves were full, and Nikola moved through those shelves the way some children move through fields or rivers, with a freedom and a hunger that seemed biological. He read in Serbian, in German, in whatever language was available. He read about science, history, philosophy, mathematics. He read poetry with his mother. He read theology with his father, though he would later quietly come to his own conclusions about what it meant. By the time he was 8 years old, he had read everything in that house twice. And then, when Nikola was 7, everything changed. Dane was riding a horse. The circumstances are not entirely clear. The family never spoke about it in detail, the kind of silence that falls over a wound too deep to keep probing. What is known is that the horse threw him. What is known is that Dane did not recover. He was gone, and the family that remained was not the same family it had been before. Milutin collapsed inward. Duka held herself together through prayer and through will. The sisters grieved in the ways that sisters grieve. Nikola was 7 years old, and he understood, with the particular clarity of a sensitive child who has inherited his mother's perceptiveness, that something permanent had broken in his world. He also understood something else, something that he would carry for the rest of his life, the thought that he had survived and his brother had not, and that this required something of him. Not guilt, exactly, something more complicated than guilt. A debt, an obligation to the continuation of things that Dane would never now continue. He threw himself into learning with an intensity that alarmed his parents. Not the gentle, curious reading he had done before. Something harder, something driven. He studied mathematics until he could no longer see the numbers clearly. He memorized poetry, following his mother's example, training his memory the way an athlete trains a muscle, pushing it past comfort, past fatigue, past the point where most people stop. He also began to notice something about the visions. They were still frightening, they still arrived uninvited, but they were changing. The random images of his early childhood were becoming something more organized. When he held a problem in his mind, the visions began to organize themselves around that problem. When he thought about a mechanism, the mechanism would appear before him, and he could look at it from every angle, could spin it in his mind's eye, could watch it operate, could see where it might fail and why. He could run experiments in his head, complete experiments, from beginning to end. With accurate results, he would not fully understand what this meant until he was older. But even at 8, 9, 10 years old, he sensed that what his mind could do was not ordinary. He just had no idea yet what it was for. The answer, when it came, would arrive in a form he did not expect. Not in the library, not in the church his father expected him to inherit. It would arrive at a river. There was a waterfall near Smiljan, the Mreznica River, rushing down through the hills, fast and cold and loud. Nikola went there often. He liked the force of it, the constancy, the way the water fell and fell and fell, without ever asking anything of anyone. He would sit on the rocks above it for hours. One afternoon, when he was somewhere around 10 years old, he sat at that waterfall and looked at it with a particular quality of attention he brought to things that interested him. He watched the waterfall. He watched the way the falling water turned the air around it into mist. He watched the mist catch the afternoon light. He sat there long enough that the watching became something else, became a kind of thinking that was not quite thinking, the kind of state his mind entered when it was working on something without being told to. And he saw something. Not a vision in the sense of the involuntary images that still sometimes overtook him. Something more intentional. He saw that the force of that falling water was being wasted. He saw that it could be captured, could be made to do work, could be directed into something useful. He saw, in the most rudimentary way, the principle of harnessing natural force to generate power. He was 10 years old. He told nobody. There was nobody to tell who would have understood. But he remembered it. He carried it home and filed it somewhere in that enormous memory, next to the books and the theorems and the lines of Serbian poetry, and he let it sit there, waiting for a time when he would know what to do with it. That time was coming, but first the world would try to make him someone else. His father wanted a priest. The church was waiting. The ceiling of a small man's ambitions was pressing down on a sky that had not yet discovered its own dimensions. And Nikola Tesla, the child of the storm, the child of light, was about to discover exactly how high and how painful the distance between those two things could be. He was about to grow up. And growing up, for Nikola Tesla, was never going to be simple. There is a specific kind of suffering that belongs to people who are built for one thing and forced toward another. It is not dramatic suffering. It does not announce itself. It lives quietly in the gap between what a person is and what the world around them has decided they should be. It accumulates slowly, year by year, the way pressure accumulates in something sealed too tightly, until one day the seal gives way and everything changes. Nikola Tesla spent his entire adolescence inside that gap. His father wanted a priest. The church in Smiljan was waiting. Milutin had planned it with the confidence of a man who has never seriously considered that his plans might not survive contact with his son's actual nature. The church, the community, the continuation of the Tesla name in a role that had dignity and permanence. This was what Milutin had decided. And in the Tesla household, what Milutin decided had the weight of scripture. Nikola said nothing. He was not, by temperament, a boy who argued. He watched his father with the careful attention he brought to everything he observed, and he absorbed what he saw, and he kept his own thoughts in a place his father could not reach. But inside that private place, something was already happening that no amount of priestly intention could stop. He had discovered mathematics, not the arithmetic of the village schoolroom, not the simple sums that teachers handed out like small tasks to occupy small minds. Real mathematics, the kind that opens out beneath you like a landscape you didn't know existed, that reveals structure underneath the apparent randomness of the world, that allows you to hold abstract truth in your hands like a physical object, and turn it and examine it from every side. He was 11 years old and he was already doing calculus problems in his head. He didn't do them on paper the way his teachers showed him. Paper felt slow, felt like it was getting in the way between his mind and the answer. He held the entire problem in his mind at once, all the variables, all the relationships, all the moving parts, and he let them interact. And the answer emerged from that interaction, the way a shape emerges from fog when you get close enough to see it clearly. His teachers noticed. They could not quite explain what they were seeing. A child who finished examinations in a fraction of the time allotted and always got the answers right was unusual enough. A child who could not explain his working because he had done no working, who had simply looked at the problem and seen the solution, was something they had no category for. They did the thing people always do when they encounter something they have no category for. They got uncomfortable. Nikola enrolled at the higher real gymnasium in Karlovac when he was around 14, living away from home for the first time. boarding with his father's sister. The school was better than anything Smiljan had offered him. More rigorous, more ambitious, taught by men who had real educations. He finished the 4-year program in 3 years, not because he rushed or cut corners, but because the material presented no resistance. He moved through it the way water moves through open space, finding no obstacle, simply filling whatever form was offered and continuing forward. Physics class was when everything shifted. The teacher was a man named Martin Sekulik, and he had a piece of equipment that Nikola had never seen before, a demonstration model of an electric motor imported from abroad, something that most schools in that part of the world did not have. Sekulik set it up at the front of the room and showed the class how it worked. Current in, rotation out. The invisible force of electricity becoming visible, becoming mechanical, becoming motion. Nikola could not stop looking at it. After class ended and the other students filed out, he stayed. He walked to the front of the room and stood in front of the motor and looked at it with the same quality of attention he had brought to that waterfall years ago. The attention that was not quite looking, that was something between observation and thought, between seeing and understanding. He asked Sekulik questions, then more questions, then questions that Sekulik could not answer, questions about the nature of the current, about why the motor required the type of current it required, about whether a different kind of current might produce a different and perhaps more elegant result. Sekulik told him to go home, but the question had been planted, and Nikola Tesla's mind, once it had found a question worth holding, did not put it down. The specific question that had taken hold of him was this. The motors of that era ran on direct current, DC power, current that flowed in one direction, constant and unvarying, like water moving always downstream. It worked. It ran the motors and lit the lights and did the work it was asked to do. But it had a profound limitation that everyone in the field had simply accepted as a fact of nature. Direct current could not travel far. The further it traveled from its source, the more it weakened, the more energy it lost to the resistance of the wires carrying it, until at some distance it became too weak to be useful. This meant that if you wanted to power a city with electricity, you needed a generating station within roughly a mile of every point you wanted to reach. Cities would need dozens of stations, hundreds eventually. The infrastructure would be enormous. The cost would be staggering. The inefficiency was built into the foundation of the thing. There has to be another way, Nikola thought. He was 15 years old. He did not know yet what the other way was, but he knew with the certainty that his mind produced when it was working on something real, something that was genuinely there to be found, that the limitation was not a law of nature, it was a limitation of the approach, and limitations of approach were things that could be changed. He held this question for years, carried it through his secondary education, carried it through the illness that nearly killed him before he could reach university, carried it through his father's continued insistence on the priesthood, carried it the way you carry something heavy and precious, something you cannot put down because it belongs to you in a way that nothing else does. The illness came when he was 17, cholera, contracted during a period when the disease was moving through the region. He was bedridden for 9 months, 9 months during which there were multiple points when the outcome was genuinely uncertain, when the doctors told his parents that recovery was not guaranteed, when Nikola himself lay in the dim room of his aunt's house and understood that he might not survive long enough to answer the question he had been carrying. His father came to his bedside. Nikola Tesla, the priest who had planned his son's future so carefully, sat beside the boy he was losing and did something he had never done before. He made a promise. If Nikola recovered, Milutin told him he could study engineering, he could go to university, he could pursue the thing that his mind was actually built for. The priesthood, the plan, all of it could wait or disappear. Just recover, just stay. Nikola recovered. He always believed, privately, that the promise had something to do with it, that the knowledge that the path was finally open had given his body a reason to keep fighting. This may have been true. It may have been the particular superstition of a man raised in a household where his mother talked about signs and his father talked about providence, but he believed it. And he went to university, and Milutin kept his promise. And that was enough. He arrived at the Austrian Polytechnic in Graz in 1875, 19 years old, thin and serious, carrying almost nothing except his extraordinary mind and the question he had been holding since he was 15. What happened next alarmed everyone around him. He studied with an intensity that his professors and classmates found difficult to distinguish from self-destruction. He attended every single lecture in every subject, whether it was required for his program or not. He was in the buildings before anyone else arrived in the morning and still there when the janitors came to lock up at night. He worked through Sundays, he worked through holidays, he worked through the social occasions that his classmates spent building the friendships and connections that would sustain them through their careers. He didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night, sometimes less. His professors sent letters to his father. These letters, several of which survive, are fascinating documents because they oscillate between admiration and genuine alarm. Your son, they told Milutin, is performing at a level we have rarely seen. He is also working in a manner that will kill him if it continues. One professor wrote that Nikola was studying at a pace that, if sustained, would end either in a great scientific contribution or in a grave, possibly both. Milutin wrote back urging restraint. Nikola did not practice restraint. He was not being reckless. He was not showing off or driven by competition with his peers. He was chasing something. The question about the motor was still there, still turning in the back of his mind behind everything else he was learning, and everything he was learning was adding something to it, another piece of the answer that was still assembling itself slowly in the vast interior space of his extraordinary memory. It was in Graz that he first encountered alternating current in a serious way. One of his professors, a man named Poeschl, was demonstrating a direct current motor, a Grammy machine, one of the better DC motors of the era. While demonstrating it, Poeschl mentioned offhandedly that people had occasionally proposed replacing direct current with alternating current that reversed direction at regular intervals, like a wave oscillating back and forth rather than flowing in one direction. He dismissed the idea immediately. Alternating current, Poeschl told the class, was theoretically interesting and practically useless. A motor running on alternating current would require commutators, the devices that synchronized current direction with the rotation of the motor. Without commutators, the motor wouldn't run. With them, it was a mechanical nightmare, all friction and sparks and parts wearing out. There was no practical way forward. The world would use direct current, that was settled. Nikola raised his hand. He suggested, quietly and precisely, that it might be possible to eliminate the commutators entirely, that a motor could be designed that didn't require them, that alternating current, properly understood and properly harnessed, might not have the limitations Poeschl had described. Poeschl looked at him for a long moment. He told Nikola, with the patient condescension of a man who has spent decades with his field and encountered many bright young students who didn't yet understand what was and wasn't possible, that what he was proposing was perpetual motion, that it violated fundamental principles, that it was, respectfully, impossible. The class moved on. Nikola sat with what he had just been told and turned it over carefully in his mind, the way he turned everything over, looking at it from every angle, testing it, searching for the flaw he must have missed that made it impossible. He could not find the flaw. What he found instead, the more he looked, was not a flaw in his idea, but a limitation in Poeschl's imagination. The professor was thinking about alternating current the way everyone thought about it, through the framework of existing motor design, trying to fit a new thing into an old shape. What Nikola was beginning to see, dimly at first and then with increasing clarity, was that you didn't fit the new thing into the old shape. You designed an entirely new shape around the new thing. He just couldn't see the new shape yet. Not fully. Not clearly enough to build it. He left Graz before completing his degree. The exact circumstances are complicated and not entirely flattering, involving gambling debts and an interrupted examination session and a period of withdrawal from the world that frightened his family. He was brilliant, and he was also, underneath everything, a young man who had been wound too tight for too long, who had spent years converting human energy into intellectual output at a rate that nothing biological was designed to sustain. He recovered, eventually. He always recovered, and he made his way, after some difficult intermediate years, to Prague, where he enrolled briefly at Charles University, and then to Budapest, where he found work at a telephone exchange. And it was in Budapest, in February of 1882, on an ordinary winter afternoon, that the most important moment in the history of electrical engineering occurred. He was walking in a city park with a friend named Anatole Szigeti. The sun was going down, and the light was doing something particular, the way winter light does at dusk, turning everything golden and slightly unreal. Nikola was reciting poetry, Goethe's Faust, from memory, which he had memorized in its entirety. His friend was listening. It was a peaceful moment, the kind of ordinary moment that has no reason to be remembered. Nikola stopped walking. He stopped mid-verse. His friend looked at him. He was standing completely still, staring at something in the middle distance, something his friend could not see, with an expression that was not quite of this world. And then Nikola picked up a stick from the ground. He bent down and drew in the dirt of the park path, lines, angles, a shape that was emerging from his hands faster than he seemed able to think it through, as though it was being transmitted through him rather than created by him. A magnetic field, a rotating field, the pattern of an alternating current flowing through a carefully arranged set of coils and producing not a jerking back and forth motion, but a smooth, continuous, elegant rotation. He had seen it, not thought it through step by step in the careful way that scientists worked. Seen it, the entire design, complete, operational, every relationship between every component clear and correct, assembled in his mind in an instant the way his visions had always assembled themselves, except that this time the vision was not random and uninvited. This time it was the answer. He turned to Szigeti and described what he was seeing. The rotating magnetic field, the motor that required no commutators, the system that could run on alternating current and produce the smooth, powerful, continuous rotation that DC motors struggle to achieve. All of it, right there, drawn in the dirt of a Budapest park at sunset. Szigeti looked at the drawing in the dirt. He looked at his friend's face. He would later say that he knew, in that moment, that something had happened. He didn't have the technical knowledge to evaluate what Nikola was describing, but he could see it in the way Nikola was standing, in the quality of stillness that had come over him, in the certainty that was radiating off him like heat. Something had happened, something that was going to change everything. Nikola stared at what he had drawn for a long moment. Then he looked up at the sunset. The Faust passage he had been reciting was about transformation, about the moment when one kind of existence gives way to something new. He had been speaking the words from memory, the way his mother had taught him to hold things in his mind so completely that they became part of him. The words had proven prophetic in a way neither Goethe nor his mother could have intended. In the dirt of that park path, in the fading winter light of Budapest, Nikola Tesla had just drawn the blueprint for the electrical system that now powers the entire modern world. He was 25 years old. He had no money, no laboratory, no institution behind him, no one who fully understood what he had just seen. He had a stick and a park path and a friend who believed him without quite knowing why. He would need all of that belief in the years ahead, because what came next was not triumph. Not yet. What came next was the long, difficult, humbling journey from the vision in the dirt to the place where the vision could finally be built. And that journey would take him through a city he had never seen, into the office of a man he had only heard about, toward a partnership that would end in betrayal, and through a war that would determine how the entire human race received its power for the next century and beyond. It started with a letter and a boat, and 4 cents in his pocket. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to people who can see further than everyone around them. It is not the loneliness of isolation. It is worse than that, in a way. It is the loneliness of proximity, of standing in a room full of intelligent, capable, well-meaning people and understanding, with quiet certainty, that what you are seeing is not what they are seeing, that the gap between your perception and theirs is not a matter of effort or education or luck, that it is something more fundamental, something that cannot be explained or taught or bridged, only endured. Nikola Tesla had lived inside that loneliness his entire life. But in 1882, when he arrived in the city of Paris at 25 years old, with the design of his rotating magnetic field still burning in his mind like a lamp that could not be switched off, he discovered something that surprised him. The loneliness was still there. It was always there. But Paris was different from anything he had known before. It was loud in a way that Smiljan had never been loud, crowded in a way that Graz had never been crowded, alive with a particular electric energy that the great cities of the 19th century produced and that smaller places simply did not have. The boulevards were wide and full of people moving with purpose. The cafes stayed lit past midnight. Arguments about philosophy and science and art spilled out of lecture halls and into the streets. The whole city felt like it was in the middle of working something out. He had come to work for the Continental Edison Company. This was Thomas Edison's European operation, running the electrical systems that Edison's direct current technology was beginning to install across the continent. Paris was wiring itself for electricity in 1882. The world was wiring itself for electricity, and the Continental Edison Company was at the center of it, staffed by engineers who understood the technology and managers who understood the business, and somewhere in between, a young Serbian immigrant who understood things that neither group could quite categorize. He had been recommended by his supervisor in Budapest, a man named Puskas, who had recognized in the particular way that occasionally happens between people in technical fields that what he was dealing with was not ordinary talent. Puskas had sent him to Paris with the kind of recommendation that people write when they feel the responsibility of having encountered something they don't want the world to miss. Tesla showed up, found his desk, and started solving problems. The problems he was given were the standard problems of electrical engineering in 1882. Generators that weren't performing correctly, installations that weren't behaving as they should, technical challenges that required careful diagnosis and methodical correction, the kind of work that occupied competent engineers for days or weeks, working through possibilities systematically, testing each one, eliminating the failures until the solution emerged from the process of elimination. Tesla typically solved them in an afternoon, not because he was rushing, not because he was cutting corners or skipping steps, because he did not work through possibilities sequentially the way other engineers did. He held the entire problem in his mind at once, all the variables interacting simultaneously, and the solution appeared in that interior space with a directness that made the sequential approach seem not just slower, but structurally different. Like the difference between finding something by searching every room in a house and knowing exactly which room it is in before you open a single door. His colleagues noticed. His supervisors noticed. Word moved through the company the way word moves through any organization when someone genuinely extraordinary appears, quietly at first, and then with increasing certainty, a kind of professional whisper network that said simply, "There is something different about this one." He was given more complex work, then more complex still. He was sent to Strasbourg, where an electrical installation had gone badly wrong and the company's normal engineers had been unable to fix it. He fixed it. He was sent to other places where other things had gone wrong. He fixed those too. He was doing excellent, valuable, increasingly visible work, and he was doing it with a calm efficiency that the people around him found difficult to reconcile with his age and his relative inexperience. But underneath all of it, underneath every problem he solved for the Continental Edison Company, the real problem was still there. The one he had been carrying since grass. Since the afternoon Peschel had dismissed alternating current with the patient confidence of a man who had decided what was possible and stopped questioning his decision. The rotating magnetic field in the dirt of the Budapest park, the motor that existed completely, perfect and operational, in his mind and nowhere else. He tried, during these Paris years, to interest people in it. He approached the directors of the Continental Edison Company. He explained, as clearly and precisely as he could, what he had designed: the alternating current motor, the rotating magnetic field, the system that could transmit power over distances that DC current could never reach, that could be stepped up and stepped down in voltage through devices called transformers that could fill not just a city block, but an entire region with electricity from a single generating station. The directors listened politely, and then they explained also politely that the company was built on direct current, that Thomas Edison himself had staked his reputation and his considerable fortune on direct current, that the infrastructure being built across Europe and America was direct current infrastructure, that the investment was enormous, the commitment was total, and that a young engineer from Serbia, however talented, was not going to walk into a boardroom and overturn all of that with the drawing he had made in a park. He was thanked for his ideas. He was sent back to his desk. He kept working. What else was there to do? He kept solving the problems they gave him and carrying the problem they wouldn't look at. And he kept thinking, kept refining, kept running the motor through its cycles in the interior theatre of his mind, watching it work perfectly, knowing that the working of it in his mind meant the working of it in the physical world was not a question of whether, but only of when and where and with whom. The when and the where and the with whom arrived in the form of a man named Charles Batchelor. Batchelor was one of Edison's closest associates, a man who had been with Edison almost from the beginning, who understood the technology and understood Edison himself in the particular way that long collaboration produces, the understanding that goes beyond knowledge into something more like fluency. He had come to Europe to oversee the continental operations, and in the course of that oversight, he encountered Nikola Tesla. He watched him work. He asked questions. He evaluated what he was seeing with the experienced eye of someone who had spent years in proximity to genuine invention and learned in that time what it looked like and what it didn't. What he saw in Tesla was unmistakable. When Batchelor returned to America, he carried with him a letter for Thomas Edison. Most of the letter dealt with business matters, the operational details of the European installations, the financial reports that Edison required. But at the end of the letter, Batchelor added something personal. He had met, he wrote, two great men in his life. Thomas Edison was one of them. The young Serbian engineer named Nikola Tesla was the other. It was not a long recommendation. It did not detail Tesla's specific achievements or describe his theories about alternating current or attempt to explain what made him different from the dozens of other talented engineers Batchelor had encountered in his career. It was simply that sentence, direct and unqualified, written by a man whose judgment Edison trusted completely. I know two great men. You are one of them. This young man is the other. Tesla received the letter and understood what it meant. This was the opening. Not the opening he had been working toward. Not the alternating current motor and the free energy dream and the grand transformation of the world's electrical systems. Just an opening. A door that might lead to a room that might lead to something else entirely. But a door. He began preparing to leave for America. The preparation did not take long. He did not have much to prepare. He packed what he had, which was not a great deal. He settled what accounts he could settle. He said what goodbyes needed to be said. And on a June morning in 1884, he boarded a ship headed for New York with everything he owned and everything he needed. What he owned was almost nothing. What he needed was different. He needed his mind. He had that. He needed the motor that lived in that mind, perfect and operational. Waiting. He had that too. He needed the letter in his pocket. He had that. And he needed something harder to name, a quality that had sustained him through Smiljan and Graz and Paris and all the dismissals and the patient, polite explanations of why what he was seeing was impossible. He had that as well. The crossing was difficult. That much survives in his accounts. The ship was not a comfortable vessel. The Atlantic in summer is not always cooperative. He had very little money for the voyage and spent much of it hungry in a way that was becoming familiar, the low-grade constant hunger of someone who is spending their resources on something other than food, because the something other than food matters more. He arrived in New York Harbor in the summer of 1884 with 4 cents in his pocket. 4 cents. The number appears in his own autobiography, stated plainly, without drama, the way he stated most things about his own hardships, as simple fact, as context, as the condition he was operating under, rather than as complaint. 4 cents. And a letter. And the motor in his head. He stepped off the ship and into New York City for the first time, and the city hit him the way it hits everyone the first time, except perhaps more intensely, because Tesla's senses had always operated at a higher register than most people's. The sensitivity that had been both his gift and his torment since childhood, now confronted with the most sensory, overwhelming city in the Western Hemisphere. The noise was extraordinary, not just loud but layered, dozens of different sounds occupying the same air simultaneously. The clatter of horse hooves on cobblestone, the shouts of vendors and porters and newspaper boys, the grinding of iron wheels on iron rails. Somewhere a steam whistle, somewhere a church bell, the low, continuous rumble of 10,000 people moving through streets that had not been designed for this many people and yet somehow accommodated them. The smell was remarkable in ways that were not always pleasant. The visual information came from every direction at once. Buildings taller than anything Smiljan had imagined possible. Signs in English and half a dozen other languages. The East River visible at the end of certain streets, like a promise or a threat. He stood in it and took it in, and did not feel overwhelmed. Exactly. He felt something closer to recognition. Not that he had been here before, he hadn't, but there was something in the scale of it, in the ambition of it, in the sheer determined energy of a city that was clearly in the process of becoming something larger than it had been, that matched something in him. Smiljan was small and quiet and looked backward to the past. Graz was older and more settled, comfortable with its own history. Paris was alive and brilliant, but dense with its own traditions, with the particular weight of a culture that knows it is great and has been great for a long time. New York did not look backward. It did not look sideways. It looked forward with an aggression that was almost physical. A city in the middle of inventing itself, not finished, not settled, not comfortable with anything yet, still becoming. He understood that feeling. He found his way through the city with the help of a few words of English and the particular resourcefulness of someone who has been managing with limited resources for long enough that resourcefulness has become a reflex. He found the address he needed. He made his way there. And eventually, on a day in the summer of 1884, Nikola Tesla walked through the door of Thomas Edison's laboratory and handed his letter to the man who ran it. Edison read it. He looked up from the page at the young man standing before him, thin, slightly disheveled from the crossing, dark-eyed, with the quality of stillness that Tesla carried with him everywhere, the sense of someone whose visible surface was quieter than what was happening underneath. Edison was not a man who wasted time. He asked Tesla a few direct questions about his experience and his abilities. Tesla answered them. The answers were accurate and detailed and delivered without either false modesty or unnecessary elaboration. The way Tesla answered everything. Edison offered him a job. It was not the job Tesla wanted. It was not the conversation about alternating current that he had been carrying across the Atlantic in his mind, the explanation of the rotating magnetic field, the case for the system that could power the world more elegantly and efficiently than anything Edison had built. That conversation was coming, but it was not this conversation. This was a job offer, practical and specific, the work of a laboratory that had a great deal of work that needed doing. Tesla accepted. He was in the building, he was in the room. He was employed by the most famous inventor in the world, the man whose name was already synonymous with electricity across 2 continents. What came next would define both of them. What came next would also, eventually, destroy the thing between them that might, in another version of this story, have become something extraordinary. Because Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla were not, as history has often portrayed them, simply rivals. Before they were rivals, they were something more complicated and more interesting than that. They were, briefly, in the same room, 2 of the greatest electrical minds who ever lived, working in the same laboratory, in the same city, in the same electric moment in the history of human civilization, when everything was being decided and nothing was settled, and the world was being rewired from its foundations up. What that could have been, what it briefly was, and why it ended the way it ended, is a story that says something important, not just about these 2 men, but about the gap that always exists between the people who see what is possible and the people who decide what gets built. That gap would cost the world more than anyone at the time could calculate, and it would cost Nikola Tesla nearly everything. Thomas Edison was not what people expected. That is the first thing you have to understand about the man. Before you can understand what happened when Nikola Tesla walked into his laboratory in the summer of 1884, the public image of Edison, even then, even while he was still alive and working, was already becoming something larger and simpler and more comfortable than the actual man. The wizard of Menlo Park, the genius of American invention, the man who had defeated the darkness. The newspapers loved him, and the newspapers had been writing about him for so long and with such uncritical enthusiasm that the portrait they had assembled bore only a partial resemblance to the original. The original was harder. Edison had grown up poor, with almost no formal education, and he carried that origin in the way people carry things that have shaped them at a level too deep for conscious examination. He did not trust theory. He did not trust elegance. He did not trust the kind of abstract reasoning that produced beautiful solutions on paper, because paper was not where problems lived. Problems lived in the physical world, in the behavior of real materials under real conditions, and the only way to understand real behavior was to test it, and to test it again, and to test it 1,000 more times until you had not a theory but a fact. This was his method: brute force empiricism, relentless, systematic, exhausting. He had famously tested over 6,000 materials in his search for a working filament for the incandescent bulb. 6,000 failures before one success. He did not experience this as failure. He experienced it as the elimination of wrong answers, each one bringing him closer to the right one by the simple logic of subtraction. He had an extraordinary tolerance for failure because he did not experience failure the way most people did. He experienced it as data. He also had something else, something that the romantic portrait of the lone inventor tends to leave out. He was a businessman, first and finally, in a way that his public image obscured, but his actions never did. He understood money, and he understood power, and he understood that invention, without commercialization, was just an interesting idea. And interesting ideas were worth exactly nothing unless someone built a system around them that turned them into products, and products into profit, and profit into more invention. The direct current electrical system he had built was not just a technological achievement, it was an economic infrastructure. Generating stations, wiring, meters, distribution equipment, a whole interlocking apparatus of physical things and business relationships and legal arrangements that represented an enormous amount of capital and commitment and risk. Edison had staked his reputation on it. His investors had staked their money on it. The cities that had signed contracts with his companies had staked their planning on it. It worked. That was the thing. Direct current worked. It lit the lights and ran the motors and did what it was supposed to do, and dismissing it as merely inadequate, as merely the wrong answer, missed the scale of what it had taken to make it work at all. Edison had done something genuinely extraordinary. It was just not, as Tesla had already understood, the final answer. But Edison did not know that. Or rather, he knew that limitations existed, as they always did in any technology, and he believed, with the confidence of a man who had built something real out of nothing, that those limitations could be addressed within the existing framework, through more stations and better equipment and continued incremental improvement. The alternative framework, the alternating current system that Tesla was carrying around in his mind like a complete and perfect object, was not something Edison was prepared to see, not because he was stupid, because he had too much invested in not seeing it. Tesla walked into all of this on a summer day in 1884 and began to work. What happened over the next year is, depending on whose account you read, either a story about a brilliant young man contributing energetically to the laboratory of a great inventor, or a story about that same young man being systematically exploited by someone who understood his value and had no intention of rewarding it appropriately. Both of these things appear to be true simultaneously, which is how it usually is with situations that end badly between people who began with good intentions. Tesla threw himself into the work. He could not do otherwise. It was not in his nature to do anything partially, to reserve a portion of himself for caution or self-protection, to keep something back. When he committed to a problem, he committed to it entirely, with the full force of a mind that was not divided against itself, that did not spend energy on doubt or calculation or the management of competing interests. He worked on Edison's DC generators, his electrical systems, the technical problems that accumulated constantly in a laboratory doing the kind of work Edison's laboratory was doing, problems of efficiency and reliability and design, problems that had been sitting unresolved for months or years because the people assigned to them did not have the particular capacity that Tesla had. He stayed late, he came early, he worked through the weekends, he solved problems that others had given up on. He redesigned systems that were functioning adequately and made them function better, more elegantly, with less waste and less noise and greater precision, the way he always redesigned things when given the opportunity, moving them from adequate towards something closer to what they ought to be. Edison watched. He was not, whatever his faults, a man who failed to notice competence. He saw clearly what Tesla was doing and what it meant, saw the quality of the intelligence at work, saw the particular way Tesla approached problems that was different from how other engineers approached them, less like searching and more like arriving, less like solving and more like revealing what was already there to be found. He gave Tesla more responsibility. Then more, he gave him the problem of redesigning the DC generators themselves, the core equipment of the entire operation, the thing that everything else depended on. It was a significant assignment, a statement of trust, and Tesla understood it as such and responded to it by doing something that even in retrospect seems almost unreasonable in its ambition and its completeness. He redesigned 24 different types of standard machines, not incrementally, not with modifications to existing designs. He started from foundational principles and worked outward, designing new systems that were more efficient and more reliable and more elegant than the ones they replaced. Systems that improved the performance of the entire operation in ways that the engineers who had built the original machines had not imagined were available. He presented this work to Edison. Edison examined it, and then Edison told him, with the directness that was one of his genuine virtues, that the work was excellent, that it represented a substantial improvement, that the laboratory was pleased. He also told him something else. He had offered Tesla, at some earlier point in their relationship, a payment of $50,000 if he succeeded in redesigning the generators. Tesla had taken this seriously. He had worked with it as a real commitment, a real number attached to a real promise. He had now delivered the work that the payment had been offered for. Edison looked at him and smiled. It was, he explained, an American joke. He had not meant it literally. Americans said things like that. It was a manner of speaking. There was no $50,000. Tesla stood in front of him and absorbed this. The room must have been very quiet. for a moment. $50,000 in 1885 was an almost incomprehensible sum to a man who had arrived in America the previous year with 4 cents in his pocket. It would have been the foundation of everything: the laboratory he needed, the equipment to build the motor that lived in his mind, the freedom from the daily requirements of survival that allowed real creative work to happen. It would have been, in the most literal sense, the beginning of the future he had been working towards since a park bench in Budapest. It was a joke. He said very little. This is consistent with everything we know about how Tesla handled these moments, not with explosion, but with a particular stillness, a quality of withdrawal, a going inside that the people who witnessed it sometimes described as unsettling, because there was no anger to respond to, no drama to engage with, just the quiet disappearance of warmth from his expression and the sense of a door closing. He resigned. He did not make a speech. He did not issue a statement. He did not tell the story to the newspapers or attempt to damage Edison's reputation or pursue any of the forms of retaliation that would have been available to him. He simply stopped working for Thomas Edison and walked out of the laboratory and into the street. He was 28 years old. He was in a city he had been in for less than a year. He had no money. He had no connections that were not connected to the man he had just walked away from. He had no laboratory, no equipment, no institutional affiliation, no one who was waiting for him or expecting him or prepared to help him. He had the motor in his mind. That was all. And in the months that followed, that turned out to be not enough to prevent what happened next, which was a period of his life that he would later describe with the same unadorned plainness he brought to everything, and which deserves to be described plainly here, because the plainness is the point. He dug ditches. The details are not complicated. He needed money to survive. The jobs available to a man with no connections and no resources in New York in 1885 were physical jobs, and he took them, and he dug trenches for electrical cables in the streets of the city that Edison's electrical system was wiring, the city whose electrical infrastructure he had been helping to improve from inside the laboratory, now being built beneath his feet by men like him, men working with their hands in the cold ground. He held a shovel, the man who had designed 24 types of electrical machines from first principles, who had lectured to professors about four-dimensional geometry in the park bench image of his own vision, who had a complete and functioning AC motor assembled in the interior theatre of his mind, in every particular detail, held a shovel and put it in the ground and lifted the dirt out and put it somewhere else. His co-workers did not know who he was. There was no reason they would. He was a tall, thin man with an accent who kept to himself and did the work and did not complain, which was enough. Nobody asked him what he was thinking about while he worked, which was fortunate, because what he was thinking about was the rotating magnetic field, the motor, the alternating current system, and the path from the ditch he was standing in to the place where he could build it. He was thinking about it constantly. He did not stop thinking about it. The ditch did not stop him. The cold did not stop him. The humiliation, if it was humiliation, and it may well have been, because whatever Tesla's equanimity, it is difficult to imagine that the gap between what he knew he was capable of and what he was doing with his hands did not produce something, some interior friction, some recognition of the distance between where he was and where he ought to be. Even that did not stop the thinking. The motor turned. In his mind, it turned. And then, the way things sometimes happen for people who are working towards something with the kind of absolute undeviating commitment that Tesla brought to this, something shifted. He met some men who were interested in electricity, not Edison men, not men who had committed themselves to a particular vision of how electrical systems should work and were therefore unable to see alternatives. New men, businessmen with capital and without ideology, men who understood that electricity was the future and were open to arguments about what form that future should take. Tesla explained the alternating current motor to them. He explained it the way he always explained technical things, with a clarity and a precision and a completeness that left no room for misunderstanding, because he understood the thing so completely himself that the understanding came through everything he said about it, the way light comes through clear glass without distortion or loss. They were interested. They formed a company, the Tesla Electric Light and Manufacturing Company. They gave him a laboratory. They gave him the equipment he needed. They gave him, for the first time since Budapest, the material conditions under which the motor that had been living in his mind for 3 years could be made to exist in the physical world. He went to work, and within a relatively short time, he had built it. The AC motor, the rotating magnetic field, made real, made physical, made operational. It worked exactly as he had seen it work in the park, exactly as it had been turning in his mind through all the months in Paris, and on the ship, and in the laboratory, and in the ditch. It worked because it had always worked, because the vision had been accurate, because the mind that had produced it was not given to fantasy or approximation, but to truth, and this was true. But the businessmen who had funded the laboratory had not funded it for the motor. They had funded it for something more immediately profitable: arc lighting, street lighting, the practical commercial application of electrical technology to the immediate needs of the market. The AC motor was interesting. The AC motor was impressive. The AC motor was not, in their assessment, what they had invested in. They pushed the motor aside. They took the patents that Tesla had developed in their laboratory. They pushed him out. He found himself, again, with nothing. No money, no laboratory, no equipment, no company. The patents for the motor he had built were now owned by men who had decided it was less valuable than arc lighting. He was back in the street, literally. This second period of destitution was, by his own account, darker than the first. He knew more now. He understood better what he had, and what it was worth, and what it would take to build the system that his motor was the heart of. He understood the scale of what was possible, and the distance between that scale and the ditch. He described, later, a period during which he was not entirely certain he would survive. Not dramatically. He did not tend toward drama, but plainly, there were days when survival itself was the project. He endured it the way he endured everything, by continuing to think, by keeping the motor turning in his mind, by understanding, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has seen something real, that what he had seen was real regardless of what was happening to him in the physical world, and that the physical world would eventually catch up. It did. Not quickly, not easily, not without cost, but eventually a name came to him the way names and opportunities came to Tesla, through the particular network of people who moved around electrical technology in New York in the 1880s, people who knew each other and knew who was working on what, and had opinions about which directions the technology was likely to go. The name was Westinghouse, George Westinghouse, a man who was, in almost every relevant way, the opposite of the person Tesla had just walked away from, a man who was about to change everything. George Westinghouse had made his first fortune from air brakes. This sounds like a small thing. It is not. Before Westinghouse invented the railroad air brake in 1869, the only way to stop a moving train was to have a man on each individual car manually operate a handbrake when a signal came from the front. This required perfect coordination. It required enough men, it required enough time. Trains in the 1860s stopped the way they stopped, which was slowly and imperfectly, and sometimes not at all, until they had travelled considerably further than anyone had intended. Westinghouse looked at this problem and understood something nobody else had quite understood, that the solution was not more men or better coordination, but a different system entirely, a system that used compressed air to apply brakes to every car simultaneously, instantaneously, from a single point of control. He built it, he patented it, he sold it, and in doing so, he made railroads genuinely safer and himself genuinely wealthy, and more importantly for the story of Nikola Tesla, he demonstrated a pattern of thinking that would define everything he subsequently did. He was not an incrementalist. He did not look at existing systems and ask how they could be marginally improved. He looked at existing systems and asked whether they were fundamentally the right approach, and when he concluded that they were not, He built something different from the ground up and let the results speak for themselves. He was also, unlike Edison, a man who believed in paying people what they were worth. He had built companies and he had worked with engineers and inventors across his career, and he had learned through the experience that is the only real teacher of such things, that the quality of the people who worked for him was directly connected to how they were treated. Not just the money, though the money mattered, the respect, the acknowledgement that their ideas were valuable, the understanding that when a man of genuine ability showed up and offered his work, the appropriate response was not to find ways to keep more of the resulting value than you had promised. He heard about Nikola Tesla through the networks that connected everyone working in electrical technology in the late 1880s, which were smaller and more intimate than people now imagine. A community of engineers and inventors and entrepreneurs in a field that was changing so fast that everyone in it was paying close attention to what everyone else was doing. Word of Tesla's AC motor had moved through these networks. The patents had been filed. The technical papers existed. People who understood electricity understood what they were looking at. Westinghouse understood what he was looking at. He went to Tesla directly, which was itself a statement. He did not send representatives. He did not arrange intermediaries. He came himself to Tesla's laboratory, and he sat down across from the man and had an actual conversation about alternating current and what it could do and what building a system around it would require. Tesla described what he had: the rotating magnetic field, the AC motor, the transformer technology that allowed voltage to be stepped up for long-distance transmission and stepped back down for safe use at the point of delivery. The complete system, every component of which existed either as built hardware or as designs so precise and complete in Tesla's mind that they might as well have been built. Westinghouse listened to all of it. Then he made an offer. The offer was real. The numbers were real. The respect implicit in taking Tesla's work seriously, in treating it as what it was, rather than as an interesting curiosity or a theoretical exercise that might eventually be useful if someone else did the hard work of making it practical, that was also real. Tesla accepted. What happened next was one of the most consequential business partnerships in the history of technology, and also, in ways that would take years to fully understand, one of the most important acts of human generosity that this particular story contains. But first, Edison had to respond. He had been watching the development of alternating current technology with the particular attention of a man who has built his fortune on a competing system and understands, at some level, he may not have fully admitted to himself that the competition is more serious than he has publicly acknowledged. He had dismissed alternating current publicly. He had told anyone who asked that it was dangerous, impractical, a technology with fundamental limitations that made it unsuitable for the kinds of applications that mattered. He believed some of this, probably not all of it. The distinction matters less than what he did next. What he did next was decide that if the technical arguments were not going to settle the question in his favor, the emotional ones might. The campaign that followed was one of the stranger episodes in the history of American business, and it needs to be described plainly because the tendency to either sensationalize it or minimize it both miss what it actually reveals about the people involved and the stakes they believed they were playing for. Edison hired a man named Harold Brown. Brown was an electrical engineer with no particular distinction except a willingness to do what Edison needed done, which was to travel the country demonstrating publicly and repeatedly the dangers of alternating current. Not in a laboratory, not in a technical paper, in front of audiences, with animals. Dogs, first. Brown and his assistant would obtain stray dogs, wire them to a platform connected to alternating current, and electrocute them before whatever audience had assembled. The demonstrations were presented as scientific inquiry, as objective evidence of the dangers of the technology. They were neither of these things. They were theatre carefully designed to produce a specific emotional response in a specific audience. An audience that did not have the technical knowledge to evaluate the claims being made, but did have the entirely natural human response to watching an animal die in front of them. Dozens of dogs died in these demonstrations. Edison was aware of them. Edison's laboratory facilities were used for some of them. He did not, as far as the historical record shows, express significant reservations about any of this. The campaign escalated. Brown obtained a Westinghouse generator, an AC generator, the specific equipment of the enemy, and used it for the demonstrations. The message was not subtle. This machine, this technology, this thing that Westinghouse and Tesla were promoting, this is what it does to living things. Then came the electric chair. The state of New York was looking for a more humane method of executing criminals than hanging. A dental surgeon named Alfred Southwick had proposed electricity based on his observation of an accidental electrocution that had appeared to cause instant, painless death. A commission was formed. Edison was consulted. Edison's position on capital punishment was that he opposed it. He opposed it on principle, as he said, and there is no particular reason to doubt this as his genuine view. But what he did next sits somewhat uncomfortably alongside that stated opposition. He recommended that the electric chair use alternating current, specifically a Westinghouse generator. The reasoning, if we are being generous, was that if electrocution was going to be used, it should use the most lethal available current. The reasoning, if we are being less generous, was that the association of AC power with state executions was precisely the kind of public relations development that Edison's campaign needed. The first execution by electric chair took place in 1890. The condemned man was named William Kemmler. The execution was badly managed, prolonged, in some accounts horrifying to witness. The newspapers covered it extensively. The word Westinghouse briefly entered the language as a verb, meaning to be executed in this manner, coined in direct reference to the technology's source. Westinghouse was furious. He fought back through legal channels, through technical papers, through every legitimate means available to him. He did not hire anyone to electrocute anything. He did not run a counter-campaign of staged demonstrations. He responded to theatre with engineering, which is the response of a man who believes that truth will eventually prevail if presented clearly and repeatedly, and with sufficient evidence. Tesla, for his part, said almost nothing publicly about any of this. This was characteristic. He was not a man who fought in the way Edison fought, not a man who used the public arena as a battlefield, not a man who believed that emotional persuasion was an appropriate substitute for technical demonstration. He found the animal demonstrations appalling. That much is clear from his private correspondence. He thought the entire strategy was beneath the dignity of serious scientific work. He went back to his laboratory and kept building. The system worked. That was what he kept coming back to. The system worked, and the demonstrations could not change that. And eventually the world would have to look at what actually worked and draw the obvious conclusion. He believed this with the certainty of a man who has been right about technical things enough times that he has developed a possibly naive trust in the ultimate rationality of outcomes. He was partly right. He was also partly wrong in a way that would take years to reveal itself fully. But in 1893, something happened that cut through all of it. Something so large and so visible that no campaign of staged demonstrations could compete with it. Something that made the argument not in technical papers or laboratory settings, but in front of 27 million people. The world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. It was the largest World's Fair that had ever been held. Organized to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, it occupied hundreds of acres on the shore of Lake Michigan, and it was, by any measure, an astonishing achievement. Buildings designed by the greatest architects in the country, exhibits from nations around the world, demonstrations of the most advanced technologies of the era, and all of it, every building and pathway and fountain and exhibition hall, needing to be lit. The contract to light the exposition was the prize that the War of Currents had been building toward, without anyone quite saying so. General Electric, the company that had absorbed Edison's electrical businesses, submitted a bid. Westinghouse submitted a bid. Westinghouse won. The cost savings of alternating current transmission were simply too significant to ignore, and a committee responsible for the exposition's finances was not in the business of paying more than necessary for anything. They awarded the contract to Westinghouse. They had not intended it as a statement about the future of electrical technology, but that is what it became. Westinghouse and Tesla went to work. What they built over the following months was the electrical system for an entire temporary city. Miles of wiring, hundreds of transformers, generating equipment on a scale that had not been attempted before, and at the end of all of it, connected to every building and fountain and pathway, 100,000 incandescent light bulbs. 100,000. The exposition opened in May of 1893. Crowds came from across the country and from around the world, 27 million of them, over the course of the summer, more than a third of the entire population of the United States at the time. They came to see the buildings and the exhibits and the spectacle of it all. And then, on the evenings when the sun went down over Lake Michigan, they saw something else. The lights came on, 100,000 bulbs, all at once, flooding the White City with a brilliance that no one in that crowd had ever seen before, a brilliance that made the world visible in the darkness in a way that gas lighting had never achieved, that candles had never achieved, that fire in any form had never achieved. The crowd, by multiple accounts, fell completely silent, and then they erupted. It is difficult now, in a world so comprehensively wired that we have largely forgotten what darkness actually looks like, to fully understand what that moment meant to the people standing in it. Electricity was not new to them. Some of them had seen electric lights before, but they had not seen it like this. They had not seen it fill the night sky over an entire city, had not felt themselves standing inside the demonstration of a completely different possible world. Tesla walked through the exposition that summer. He gave demonstrations of his own in the Westinghouse exhibit, allowing alternating current to pass through his own body to produce light, standing in the center of a swirling electrical field, like a figure out of mythology, illuminating himself with the force he had spent his adult life trying to harness. The crowds watched with the particular mixture of awe and unease that genuine novelty produces. Edison did not attend the exposition. The war of currents was not over. It would take years more for the final resolution to arrive, for the decision to be made definitively in favor of alternating current, for the infrastructure to shift completely. These things do not happen overnight, and they do not happen without cost. But after Chicago, everyone knew how it was going to end. The world had seen what alternating current could do. The world had stood inside the demonstration. The world had felt, however briefly, what it was like to live inside a different kind of light. What came next? The Niagara Falls contract, the final victory, the beginning of the truly modern electrical world. All of it followed from that summer in Chicago with the logic of a sentence following its opening word. It was already written. It was just waiting to be completed. And Tesla, who had carried the motor in his mind through a park in Budapest and a ditch in New York, and 2 betrayals and countless dismissals and the deliberate electrocution of animals in his technology's name. Tesla stood in the White City and watched the lights burning and understood that he had been right. He had always been right. The question that had been waiting since that afternoon was not whether, it had never been whether. It had only ever been when. When had arrived. But winning, for Nikola Tesla, had a way of arriving with something else attached, something he had not yet learned to anticipate, something that would reveal itself fully only after the victory was complete and the attention of the world had moved on to the next thing. And Tesla found himself standing, once again, in the particular silence that follows the end of a war. He had won the war of currents. What he had not won, what no victory in any war ever fully delivers, was the future he had imagined when he first drew that motor in the dirt. That future was larger, and reaching for it was going to cost him everything the war had built. There is a particular kind of freedom that arrives only after a long war. It is not the freedom you imagined during the fighting. During the fighting, you imagine that winning will feel like release, like the opening of a door, like stepping from a dark room into open air, and there is some of that. But there is also something underneath it that the imagination does not prepare you for. a silence where the noise used to be, a stillness that takes some getting used to. The discovery that you have spent so long organizing your entire self around the contest, that the self, now that the contest is over, is not entirely sure what it is for. Tesla won the War of Currents in the early 1890s. The Niagara Falls contract arrived in 1893, the same year as Chicago, the same year the White City blazed with his 100,000 bulbs, and it was the final confirmation, if any was needed. The world's most famous waterfall, the most powerful natural force on the North American continent, would be harnessed using alternating current. Tesla's system, his motors, his generators, his transformers, his rotating magnetic field that had been drawn in the dirt of a Budapest park 11 years before and had lived in his mind through every ditch and laboratory and betrayal between that park and this moment. The Niagara generators began operation in November of 1896. Power flowed from the falls to the city of Buffalo, 22 miles away. Then further, the distance that direct current could never have bridged. He had done what he said he would do. The rotating magnetic field was real, and it was working, and it was powering a portion of the civilized world and would eventually power all of it. And standing in that victory, Tesla found himself looking at something larger. The AC motor had never been the final destination. It had been the first step on a path that he had understood from the beginning, even when the first step was all he could see clearly. Now, with the first step behind him, the next step came into focus with the particular sharpness of something that has been waiting. What if the wire itself was unnecessary? The entire system he had built, the system that was now humming through the copper veins of the industrializing world, still depended on wire. You generated the power, you stepped it up through transformers, you transmitted it over distances that direct current could not manage, you stepped it back down and delivered it to the point of use. All of this along wires. Copper wire, expensive to produce, expensive to string across the countryside, expensive to maintain, dependent on infrastructure that poor people and rural people and people in the parts of the world that capital had not yet reached could not access. The wire was the limitation. The wire was the thing that made electricity a commodity available to those who could afford the infrastructure and unavailable to those who could not. The wire was, when you looked at it the way Tesla looked at everything, not a necessary feature of electrical transmission, but a habit, an artifact of how things had been built, a constraint that felt like a law of nature, but was actually just a choice. He began to think about the Earth. The Earth was a conductor. This was not new knowledge. It was understood in the physics of the era that the Earth could carry electrical current under the right conditions. What Tesla began to think, what assembled itself in that interior laboratory he had been running since childhood, was a possibility so large that he spent years approaching it from different directions before he trusted himself to say it plainly. What if the Earth itself could be turned into a conductor of useful power? What if you could send electrical energy not through wires strung above the ground, but through the ground itself, through the body of the planet, from a transmitting station anywhere to a receiving station anywhere else? What if the technology that had just lit the World's Fair could be redesigned from its foundations to deliver power not to the buildings connected to it by copper wire, but to any point on the surface of the Earth, connected by nothing more than a rod pushed into the soil? What if electricity could be free, not inexpensive, not competitively priced, free, available to anyone, anywhere, who pushed a rod into the ground and connected their device to it? The farmer in Nebraska, the village in India, the family in the parts of Africa and South America that no electrical company had reached and would not reach for generations because there was no profit in stringing wire to people who had no money to pay for what the wire delivered, free. He did not say this to everyone at first. He said it to himself, in the way that enormous ideas are first held and turned and tested in private before they are offered to the world. He kept working. He kept building. He took the prize money he had received for contributions to electrical science, and he did what he always did, with money which was to put it back into equipment and experiments, back into the process of finding out whether what he was seeing in his mind was what was actually there. He needed a laboratory, not the kind of laboratory he had been using in New York, something larger, something that could generate the scale of electrical phenomena he needed to study to understand whether the Earth could do what he believed it could do. He went to Colorado. Colorado Springs in the spring of 1899 was a small city at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, chosen by Tesla for reasons that were both practical and characteristic. The altitude was high, which affected the behavior of electrical discharges in ways he wanted to study. The air was dry, the space was available, the distance from New York was perhaps not entirely incidental. New York was Edison's city, was Westinghouse's city, was the city of investors and journalists and people who had opinions about what Tesla should be doing and what it should be worth. Colorado Springs was somewhere else entirely. He built a laboratory outside the city, a large wooden building with a retractable roof, because the experiments he was planning would require sending electrical discharges into the open sky, and a fixed roof would get in the way. He installed equipment that he had designed himself. He built a large resonant transformer, a device for generating oscillating electrical currents of very high frequency and very high voltage, on a scale considerably beyond anything he had built before. At the center of the laboratory, rising through the retractable roof, he erected a wooden tower. At the top of the tower, a copper sphere. Beneath it, 200 feet of iron pipe driven into the ground. Transmitter above, receiver below, the Earth in between. What happened in the Colorado Springs laboratory over the following months was witnessed by a small number of people and documented primarily in the notebooks Tesla kept throughout his working life. Notebooks written in his own precise hand, in several languages, full of calculations and observations, and the particular combination of technical rigor and almost visionary speculation that characterized everything he did. The experiments with the magnifying transmitter, as he called the large resonant transformer, produced results that were, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. He lit 200 incandescent bulbs, wirelessly, not in the laboratory, not connected by any wire to the generator, 25 miles away, 200 bulbs burning in the Colorado darkness, powered by energy transmitted through the Earth itself from a tower in a wooden building on the edge of the city. He thought about the farmer in Nebraska, and the village in India, and the family in Africa, and felt the weight of what he was holding. He created lightning, not the small electrical sparks of the laboratory demonstrations he had given in New York, the ones where he passed current through his own body for audiences who watched with the mixture of terror and delight that genuine novelty produces. Real lightning, controlled, artificial lightning on a scale that nature itself rarely achieves at ground level. Bolts of electrical discharge that leapt from the copper sphere atop his tower and reached out into the Colorado sky, branching and crackling and illuminating the darkness for distances that people in the nearby city could not at first account for. The thunder was audible for miles. Local reports from the period describe strange phenomena around the laboratory during the months of his experiments. Balls of fire rising from the ground near the building, sparks appearing spontaneously from the soil in surrounding areas, horses at a farm some distance away receiving shocks through their metal shoes, the ground itself apparently carrying current. He was not trying to shock horses, he was trying to prove that the earth conducted. The horses were confirmation of a kind, though not the confirmation he would have chosen. He also, on one particular night, claimed to receive something. This is the part of the Colorado Springs chapter that history has handled uneasily, because it sits at the border between the verifiable and the extraordinary, between the documented and the disputed, between the Tesla, who was a rigorous and extraordinarily accurate engineer, and the Tesla, who was also, underneath everything, the child of a woman who believed in signs and a father who believed in providence, raised in a tradition that did not draw a sharp line between the physical and the mystical. He was observing his instruments late one night when he noticed something unusual in the data. Regular oscillations, not random noise, not the irregular variations that natural electromagnetic phenomena produced. Something rhythmic, something that had the quality, he wrote afterward, of a signal. Something that was not the earth and was not his equipment, and was not anything he could immediately explain by reference to any known source. He suggested, later, in several interviews and papers, that he had received a transmission from another planet, from Mars most likely, which was at that time a subject of serious scientific speculation as a potentially inhabited world. He did not say this with certainty. He said it as a possibility, as the most plausible explanation he could construct for what his instruments had recorded. The scientific community was not receptive. The newspapers were very receptive, which was not quite the same thing, and in some ways made matters worse. What he had actually received was probably, based on subsequent analysis, a naturally occurring electromagnetic phenomenon. The ionosphere was not yet understood in 1899, and the kinds of signals it produced could behave in ways that mimicked regularity without being regular in the meaningful sense. The explanation does not require anything beyond known physics. But the way Tesla talked about it, the openness with which he offered the possibility of interplanetary communication to reporters who were always looking for the next extraordinary story about the Wizard of the West, as they had begun to call him, did something to his public image that had lasting consequences. It made him seem to serious scientists like someone whose work needed to be taken with a degree of caution. This mattered, not immediately, not in a way he could fully feel in Colorado Springs in 1899, when he was the most famous inventor in the world, after Edison, and the most admired and the most written about and the most sought after for comment on any electrical or scientific question. But it planted something, a seed of doubt about his judgment, about his relationship to evidence, about whether the extraordinary things he claimed could always be trusted. He did not know this yet. He was standing in his laboratory in the Colorado darkness, and the lightning he had made was still crackling in the sky above him, and the earth beneath his feet was humming with current, and the 200 bulbs were burning 25. Miles away, and somewhere in his instruments, was the record of something he could not yet explain. He packed up the Colorado Springs laboratory in January of 1900 and returned to New York. He had what he needed. He had confirmed to his own rigorous satisfaction that the Earth conducted. That wireless transmission of power was not merely theoretically possible, but practically achievable. That the system he had been thinking about since the victory at Niagara could be built. He had the design in his mind, complete and specific and detailed in the way his designs had always been complete and specific and detailed, every component in its place, every relationship understood, every potential failure point identified and addressed. He needed money to build it. He needed a great deal of money, more than he had ever had, including the prize money and the Westinghouse royalties that he had already largely spent on Colorado. He needed an investor, and there was, in New York in 1900, a man whose name was synonymous with money in the way that Tesla's name was synonymous with electricity. A man who had financed railroads and steel companies and banks, who had restructured the finances of the United States government when they needed restructuring, who had more capital at his disposal than some nations, and who had, it was said, an appetite for interesting propositions. His name was John Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan. And what happened next, what Tesla brought to that meeting, and what Morgan gave him, and what Morgan eventually took away, is the part of this story that everything before it was leading toward. The part that explains the seized notebooks, and the hotel room, and the 4 cents at the beginning, and the government agents at the end. The part that explains everything. John Pierpont Morgan was not a man who took meetings with everyone who asked for one. He could not have been. The requests came from every direction, from every industry, from every person in America who needed capital and believed, as almost everyone who needed capital believed, that they had the one idea that would justify an exception to whatever process stood between them and Morgan's attention. He had systems for managing this, people whose job was to filter and evaluate and send back the polite declines that kept the foe manageable. Tesla got through the systems. This was partly because of who he was by 1900. The AC motor, the Chicago World's Fair, Niagara Falls, the Colorado Springs experiments that had filled the newspapers with stories about artificial lightning and wireless light, and a man who seemed to operate outside the normal boundaries of what inventors could do. He was the most famous scientist in the world after Edison, and in some quarters more famous than Edison, and Morgan was a man who understood that fame was itself a form of capital, that the attention of the world had value, that being associated with someone who commanded that attention was not nothing. But it was also because of what Tesla was proposing. He sat across from Morgan and described what he wanted to build. Not another motor, not another improvement to an existing system, not an incremental advance on the technology he had already delivered to the world. Something new, something that went beyond everything he had built before, in the way that the AC system had gone beyond the limitations of direct current, by changing not the implementation, but the fundamental architecture, by asking not how to do the current thing better, but whether the current thing was the right thing at all. He wanted to build a tower on a piece of land on Long Island, on the North Shore, in a place called Shoreham that was close enough to New York to be accessible and far enough to have the space he needed. He wanted to erect a structure unlike anything that had been built before. Not a lighthouse, not a factory chimney, not an antenna in the sense that the word was beginning to be used, for the nascent technology of wireless telegraphy that Guglielmo Marconi was simultaneously developing across the Atlantic. Something different, something that used the principles he had confirmed in Colorado, the conductivity of the Earth, the behavior of the ionosphere that he had been the first to seriously study, the possibility of transmitting energy not through wire but through the body of the planet itself, to create a global system of wireless power transmission. A tower that would send electrical energy into the Earth and into the sky simultaneously, creating a resonant circuit of planetary scale, so that anywhere on the surface of the Earth, any person with a simple receiving device could draw from that circuit the power they needed for whatever they needed it for. He also wanted to use it for something else. He wanted it to transmit information, voice, images, text, financial data, news. The entire content of human communication, sent wirelessly around the world at the speed of electricity, received by devices that did not require the wire infrastructure of the telegraph and the telephone. He described a system in which a person in New York could send a message to a person in London, not through a cable laid along the ocean floor, but through the air and through the earth, instantly, reliably, for a cost approaching nothing. He was describing the internet. He was describing mobile telecommunications. He was describing both of these things simultaneously in a meeting with J.P. Morgan in the year 1900. Morgan listened. He was not a man who showed enthusiasm easily, had built a reputation partly on the ability to sit across a table from someone making a very large claim and give them nothing to read in his expression. He asked questions. The questions were good ones, direct and financial. The questions of a man who understood that the gap between a compelling idea and a working system was the gap where most money disappeared. Tesla answered them. He always answered questions well when the questions were about what he was building. The answers were precise and detailed and carried the particular quality of certainty that came not from salesmanship, but from actual knowledge, from the understanding that he was describing something he had already partially built, that the Colorado experiments were not speculation, but evidence, that the principles involved were not theoretical, but tested. Morgan agreed to invest $150,000, a very large sum in 1900, not everything Tesla had asked for, but enough to begin, enough to buy the land, hire the workers, start construction. Morgan would receive 50 to 1% of the patents that emerged from the work on wireless telegraphy and telephony. Tesla shook his hand and went to Long Island and began to build. The land in Shoreham was 200 acres of open ground near the water, and Tesla walked it in the early weeks of 1901 with the particular quality of attention he brought to physical spaces, understanding the site the way he understood everything completely, from every angle, calculating what would need to go where and why. He made his decisions quickly. He always made decisions quickly when he understood what he was deciding. The uncertainty for Tesla was never about the answer. It was always about whether he had asked the right question. He hired the architect, Stanford White, one of the most celebrated architects in America, to design the ancillary structures, the laboratory building, the housing for equipment, the facilities that the workers would need. White was famous for grand things, for buildings that announced themselves, and what he designed for the Wardenclyffe site was appropriately serious. A large brick building with the particular solidity that the late 19th century associated with permanence and purpose. But the building was not the thing. The thing was the tower. It rose from the center of the site, a wooden framework structure climbing into the Long Island sky, 187 feet tall, taller than anything near it, taller than the trees that surrounded the property, tall enough to be visible from considerable distances across the flat landscape of Long Island's North Shore. At its top, a copper hemisphere 55 feet in diameter, like the cap of something, like the topmost part of a structure that was trying to make contact with something above it. And below the tower, driven into the earth by a shaft that Tesla had designed with the same care he brought to everything, a network of iron pipes extending downward into the water table, making the connection in the other direction, reaching into the ground the way the tower reached into the sky. He called it Wardenclyffe, and standing beneath it, watching it rise, he felt something that his normally precise written voice occasionally struggled to contain. Something about it moved him in a way that the AC motor had not moved him, had not been able to move him because the AC motor had been a solution to a problem, an answer to a question that physics had set him. Wardenclyffe was something else. Wardenclyffe was his. Not in the proprietary sense. He had given away royalties before and would again had a relationship with money that consistently prioritized building over keeping. He meant something more personal than ownership. The AC motor had been the product of a question the world had asked and he had answered. Wardenclyffe was the product of a question he had asked himself. A question nobody had asked him to answer. A question that went beyond engineering into something that felt, when he stood beneath the tower and looked up at it, almost like ethics. He believed with a completeness that is difficult to fully convey that the concentration of electrical power in the hands of companies that charged for it was wrong, not economically suboptimal, not merely inconvenient for those who could not afford it. Wrong. He believed it the way his father had believed in the tenets of the Orthodox faith, with the unquestioning certainty of someone who had looked at something and understood it as simply and clearly as he had ever understood anything. Power was a natural force. The earth conducted it. The sky held it. The sun generated it constantly, in quantities so vast that the total electrical consumption of human civilization was a trivial fraction of what arrived from 93 million miles away every day. The idea that access to this force should be rationed by ability to pay struck him as no more reasonable than rationing access to air or water or the light of the same sun that produced it. He had not said all of this to Morgan. He had said wireless transmission of power and wireless communication, and he had said them truthfully, and the system he was building would deliver them. But the larger vision, the free part, the part where the tower was not a commercial product, but a gift to the species, the part where the rod pushed into the ground anywhere on Earth was not a subscription service, but a birthright. This he had not fully articulated. Whether he had not said it because he knew it would end the conversation, or because he had genuinely not yet decided how to explain it, is a question that the historical record cannot fully resolve. The construction proceeded through 1901 and into 1902. The tower rose, the laboratory building filled with equipment. Workers moved across the site. Tesla drove out from New York regularly, staying for days at a time, overseeing, adjusting, making the small modifications that the gap between theory and construction always requires. He was, by multiple accounts from the people who worked with him during this period, driven with a quality that was different from the driven quality of his earlier work, more urgent, more personal. And then Morgan sent a letter. The letter asked how the project was progressing and when it might begin generating return on the investment. which was a reasonable question for an investor to ask, and which Tesla could not answer in the terms Morgan was using, because what Tesla was building was not, in the conventional sense, a business. It was infrastructure. It was foundation. It was the basis from which the business would eventually emerge. But the timeline between foundation and return was not the kind of timeline that Morgan's financial model accommodated. Tesla wrote back. He explained what the tower was for more fully than he had explained it in the initial meeting. He described the global system. He described, apparently with more candor than he had shown before, the full scope of what he envisioned, including the part about universal access, including the part about the cost being minimal or nothing, including the part where the point of the system was not to generate profit, but to deliver power to everyone who needed it. Morgan read this. He wrote back with a question that was brief and direct, and that Tesla never forgot, and that has been quoted in various forms so many times since that it has become, accurately, the encapsulation of the entire episode. He asked, in essence, where the money came from if anyone could use the system for free. He asked where the meter went. If everyone can draw power from the earth for nothing, Morgan said, where do I put the meter? This was a business question, a reasonable business question, from the perspective of someone who had invested $150,000 in a commercial enterprise. It was also a philosophical question, though Morgan did not intend it as one, and it was the question that ended everything, because Tesla did not have an answer to it that Morgan could accept. The meter went nowhere. That was the whole point. The meter went nowhere because the meter was the thing that was wrong with the current system, was the thing that Wardenclyffe was built to make obsolete, was the thing that stood between the power and the people who needed it. He had no answer. Morgan withdrew his funding. Not all at once. The withdrawal happened in stages, as these things tend to, through a series of letters and meetings and requests for assurance that Tesla could not provide, and requests for revised projections that Tesla could not honestly produce. But the direction was clear from the moment of that question. The money stopped. The construction slowed. The workers went unpaid and then departed. The suppliers stopped delivering materials. The tower stood at 187 feet, complete in its frame, the copper hemisphere gleaming at its top. And nothing happened at the top of it, because the equipment that would make something happen had not been fully installed, and the money to install it was no longer coming. Tesla tried to find other investors. He wrote letters and made calls and arranged meetings, and explained the system to people who were interested in wireless technology, in communication, in the future of electrical power. Some of them were genuinely interested. None of them were willing to fund something that its creator had publicly associated with free universal access. The word free had done its work in the conversation with Morgan, and would do its work again in every conversation that followed. He borrowed against his other patents. He took loans he could not repay. He sold assets. He did everything that a man does when he is trying to hold a dream in the physical world with tools that were not designed to hold dreams. The tower stood. It stood for years, incomplete, gradually falling behind in its taxes, surrounded by the brick laboratory building that still held Tesla's equipment, still held his notebooks and his papers and the records of the Colorado experiments and everything that his mind had produced in the years of working toward this moment. The people in Shoreham could see it from their houses, this strange copper-capped thing rising from the North Shore land, this thing that looked like it was supposed to do something and was not doing it. This tower that stood in the Long Island landscape like a question without an answer. Tesla visited less often. The visits became painful in the way that unfinished things are painful to the people who know what they were supposed to be. He stood beneath it once and looked up at the copper sphere against the sky and understood, with the part of his mind that had always been brutally honest with him about what was and what was not, that the distance between what the tower was and what it was supposed to be was not going to close. Not with the resources he had. Not alone. He did not say this to anyone. He rarely said the things that cost him most to acknowledge. He went back to New York and kept working and kept writing and kept filing patents on other technologies, the bladeless turbine, the speedometer, other things, smaller things that might generate enough income to keep the options open, to keep Wardenclyffe alive in some minimal form, until circumstances changed. Circumstances did not change in the direction he needed them to change. They changed in another direction entirely, and the tower, which had been built to give the world something it did not know it needed, stood there in the Long Island landscape and waited for a decision that was coming toward it, from a direction that Tesla had not anticipated, from a world that was, by 1917, no longer the world in which the tower had been conceived. The war had arrived, and with it, the end. There is a particular kind of fall that does not happen all at once. It happens in stages. Each stage feels, at the time, like a temporary setback, like something that can be recovered from, like the kind of difficulty that belongs to the middle of a story rather than the beginning of an ending. You keep expecting the ground to level out. You keep expecting the next thing to be the thing that reverses the direction. And then one day you look back at the distance between where you are and where you were, and you understand that what you were experiencing as a series of recoverable moments was in fact a single sustained decline, and that you have been falling the entire. That is what happened to Nikola Tesla after Wardenclyffe. It did not happen all at once. It took years, and during those years he kept working, kept filing patents, kept giving interviews, kept presenting the appearance of a man who was still in the middle of his story rather than past its turning point. He was very good at this. He had always been very good at presenting what needed to be presented and keeping the rest inside. But the fall was happening. The first blow, the one that history has tended to underemphasize because the story of the War of Currents overshadows almost everything else in Tesla's biography, had actually arrived before Wardenclyffe was abandoned. It arrived quietly, through the patent office, through the legal system, through the institutional processes that are supposed to protect inventors from exactly what was happening to Nikola Tesla. Guglielmo Marconi had sent a radio signal across the Atlantic in December of 1901. The world celebrated. The newspapers declared Marconi the father of wireless communication, the inventor who had conquered distance, the man who had made the impossible routine. He became, in the public imagination, the figure whose name was synonymous with radio, the way Edison's name was synonymous with the light bulb and Tesla's name was increasingly synonymous with a past accomplishment rather than a present force. Tesla read about all of this and felt something that his characteristic reticence made it difficult to express, but that his private correspondence made clear enough. Marconi had used his patents, not similar patents, not parallel discoveries arrived at independently through different routes, his patents. The specific technical approaches that Tesla had developed and filed in the 1890s, approaches that the Patent Office had already evaluated and granted as novel and original, were the foundations on which Marconi's system was built. Tesla had known this was coming. He had watched Marconi's development with the attention of a man who recognizes his own work being assembled by someone else. And he had said so, had told people, had made the claim in the direct and unequivocal way he made all technical claims. He said, "Marconi is a good fellow. Let him continue. He is using 17 of my patents." He said this without particular bitterness, without heat, the way you state a fact that is inconvenient but incontrovertible. He said it, and he continued working, and he continued believing that the truth of the matter would eventually assert itself through the proper channels. The Patent Office initially agreed with him. In 1900, they had rejected Marconi's patent applications because they conflicted with Tesla's prior patents. This was the correct decision. It was based on actual examination of the actual technical documents. Then Edison, who had reasons of his own to want Marconi to succeed, provided financial backing for Marconi's company. Then Marconi's company had resources and legal representation and the ability to pursue the kind of sustained institutional campaign that Tesla, who had never been good at the financial management required to sustain such campaigns, could not match. Then the Patent Office reversed its position. Marconi's patents were granted, the prior art, Tesla's work, was set aside. Tesla filed suit. He pursued it for years. He pursued it with the money he did not have, and the legal representation he could barely afford, and the absolute certainty of a man who knows he is right and cannot quite believe that being right is not sufficient. He was right, but being right was not sufficient. The court cases moved slowly and went nowhere definitive, while Tesla was alive. The vindication, when it finally came, arrived in 1943, the year Tesla died, when the United States Supreme Court ruled that Marconi's key patents were invalid because they had been anticipated by Tesla's prior work, specifically among others. By then, it did not matter in the way it would have mattered in 1909, when the Nobel Prize was given, when the name Marconi was being written into history books, when Tesla was filing suits and being answered with delays and procedural maneuvers and the slow grinding machinery of institutional indifference. By 1943, Tesla was already gone. The second blow came from a direction he had not anticipated, which is perhaps forgivable because no one could have anticipated it, because it required the outbreak of a world war and the particular paranoia that wars produce in governments, and the decision by the United States military that a tower on Long Island, a strange, copper-capped thing that had been sitting unfinished and untaxed and increasingly dilapidated for years, might be useful to the enemy. It was 1917. The war had been going since 1914, and America had recently entered it. The German Navy was operating submarines off the Atlantic coast. Wireless communication was a military concern. Any large antenna structure within range of the ocean was potentially a tool for enemy coordination, for signaling, for whatever purpose an adversary might put a tower to if they could reach it. The United States government looked at Wardenclyffe and decided it was a security risk. They sent men with dynamite. The tower came down in a single day. 187 feet of wooden framework. The copper sphere that had gleamed at its top for 16 years, the structure that Tesla had stood beneath and felt something that he had rarely felt in his life, all of it reduced to rubble and dragged away for scrap metal. The war effort needed the copper. The security apparatus needed the tower gone. Both things happened simultaneously, efficiently, without ceremony. Tesla was in New York when it happened. He did not go to watch. He heard about it afterward, the way you hear about things that you cannot bring yourself to witness directly, through accounts from other people, through the newspaper coverage that noted the demolition as a brief item of war-related infrastructure clearance. Nothing more significant than that. He had a breakdown after. Not his first. There had been the collapse in Budapest, the years of darkness after the Graz laboratories, the difficult period following the Edison betrayal, but this one was different in character from the others, which had been the breakdowns of a young man under pressure, the system responding to stress with temporary shutdown. This was something quieter and more permanent, a dimming rather than a collapse, something going out. He had owed back taxes on the Wardenclyffe property for years, had borrowed against the land itself as his financial situation deteriorated, had managed through legal manoeuvring and creditor patience to keep nominal ownership while producing nothing from the site. After the demolition, the creditors moved immediately. The land was seized, sold, to pay the debts. Wardenclyffe passed out of Tesla's hands without ceremony and without compensation, and with it went the last physical evidence that the dream had ever been more than a drawing in the Colorado dirt. He was 62 years old. He had 36 years of inventions behind him. The AC motor, the transformer, the Tesla coil, the radio system, the rotating magnetic field that powered the modern world. He had more patents than most inventors produce in a lifetime. He had redesigned the entire electrical infrastructure of the human race. He had nothing, not metaphorically nothing, actual, literal nothing. Debts he could not pay, a reputation that was sliding from celebrated to historical, from current to past tense, from the man who is doing things to the man who once did things. He moved into the Hotel St. Regis, then to lesser hotels as his ability to pay declined, negotiating arrangements with management that involved promises of future payment and the particular dignity-preserving fictions that both parties maintain when the alternative is eviction and someone has decided that eviction is not the story they want to be part of. He was still working. This is important and tends to get lost in the romantic narrative of Tesla's decline, which emphasizes the isolation and the pigeons and the unpaid hotel bills, and allows those images to suggest that the work had stopped. The work had not stopped. The work never stopped. He filed patents on the bladeless turbine, an elegant design that used the properties of viscous flow to generate rotation without the mechanical complexity of conventional turbine blades. He worked on a vertical takeoff aircraft, describing a device that anticipated the helicopter and the drone by decades. He worked on a particle beam weapon, something he called the teleforce, which the newspapers would eventually call the death ray, which was not exactly what Tesla intended the name to convey, but which served his purposes in a particular way that we will return to. He gave interviews. He gave them on his birthdays, which he observed with a particular attention to the press gathering that was partly genuine enjoyment of the occasion and partly a calculated effort to remain visible, to remind the world that he was still there, still thinking, still producing, in an era when the world had largely decided it already knew the Tesla story and had filed it appropriately in the past. The interviews became slightly strange. This is documented, and it deserves to be described honestly rather than either dismissed or exaggerated, because the strangeness was real and its nature is worth understanding. He made claims that were difficult to evaluate. The teleforce weapon could, he said, bring down fleets of aircraft from 250 miles away. He had discovered a new source of energy that would make all existing energy infrastructure obsolete. He had achieved things in his laboratory that he was not yet ready to disclose, but that would, when disclosed, transform the understanding of what was physically possible. Some of these claims were almost certainly genuine descriptions of real work that his financial circumstances prevented him from completing or demonstrating. The particle beam research was real. The turbine was real and patented. The vertical takeoff aircraft was real as a concept and would prove real as a technology within decades. Some of the claims were harder to locate in demonstrable reality. The newspapers covered them with the enthusiasm that newspapers bring to any story about the eccentric genius and his outlandish claims, which is an enthusiasm that contains within it a particular kind of condescension, the condescension of people who believe they are being generous by paying attention at all. The Tesla of the 1920s and 1930s became a slightly different figure in the public imagination than the Tesla of the 1890s. Still remarkable, still worth writing about on his birthday, but remarkable in the way that old marvels are remarkable. Familiar, known, safely past the point of being threatening or requiring recalibration of what was thought to be true. Meanwhile, in the actual ledgers of the actual world, the money was not there. Hotels changed, arrangements were renegotiated. He moved from the St. Regis to the Hotel New Yorker, where the management had agreed to let him occupy room 3327 in exchange for what amounted to the promise of eventual settlement, a promise that everyone involved understood would probably not be settled in the conventional financial sense. He fed the pigeons. This has become the most famous image of Tesla's later years, the man who had stood inside his own artificial lightning in Colorado, who had lit the Chicago World's Fair, who had imagined free energy for the entire human race, walking through the streets of Manhattan, with birdseed in his pockets, crouching in Bryant Park to let the birds eat from his hands. It was not pathetic. That framing misses what it actually was. He had always responded to animals with a directness and openness that he found difficult to maintain with people, for reasons that his life had given him. People wanted things. People had opinions about who he was and what he should be doing, and why he had not managed to be more commercially productive with the gifts he obviously possessed. People carried expectations and histories and the particular weight of knowing Tesla's story, which meant that no interaction with a person was ever quite free of the story. The pigeons did not know his story. he developed among the population of New York pigeons he fed regularly across several decades. What he described in his private notes as genuine attachments, individual birds that he recognized, and whose individual fates he followed with a care that some people found touching and others found troubling, and that was, in truth, simply Tesla being Tesla, attaching completely to whatever had his attention, caring without reservation. There was one pigeon in particular, a white female with grey-tipped wings. He wrote about her in terms that his biographers have handled awkwardly ever since, because the terms are the terms of love, straightforward and unself-conscious. The way a man who has not learned to be embarrassed by his own feelings describes something that matters to him, without caring how the description lands. He wrote that he had loved that pigeon the way a man loves a woman. He wrote that she had mattered to him in a way that nothing had mattered since the work had mattered, since the motor and the tower and the dream of free energy had been the things organizing his days. She died eventually. He recorded it. The recording has the quality of someone noting a loss that is larger than the thing lost, the way significant losses always point backward to all the other losses they contain. After she was gone, something shifted. Not collapsed, not broke, shifted, a quiet further withdrawal from the parts of his life that still reached outward. He went back to room 3327 and worked. Outside, in the city he had lit, in the world that ran on his invention, in the buildings wired with the system that bore his name in the technical literature, if not on the street signs, the lights burnt on. He had given them that. He had given them everything he had, and when he had nothing left to give them, he had given them what was supposed to come next. The tower and the dream and the future where the meter went nowhere, and they had taken the tower down with dynamite and asked where the meter went. He did not ask for anything back. He had never known how to ask for things back. That was always the problem. And it was also, if you looked at it from a certain angle, in a certain kind of light, the thing that made him who he was. The man who gives without keeping an account of what has been given does not do so because he has not noticed the accounting. He does so because the giving was never the part he was focused on. He was focused on what the thing he was giving could do, on what the world would become when it received it. He never quite gave up on that, not even in room 3327. Not even at the end. The end was coming, now, slowly at first, and then the way all ends come, faster than expected. There is a moment in the life of every great friendship when you realize that most of the people you have loved are gone. It does not arrive as a single revelation. It accumulates. A letter that goes unanswered because the person it was written to is no longer there to answer it. A name that comes into your mind in connection with something you have just read or discovered. A name you want to share the thing with. And then the understanding, arriving a half second later, that the sharing is no longer possible. The absence does not diminish with time in the way that other losses diminish. It stays precise, it stays the exact size and shape of the person who is no longer there. Tesla knew this feeling intimately by the time he settled into room 3327 for the last time. He had known remarkable people, not the professional acquaintances and the business contacts and the investors, though there had been plenty of those. Actual friendships, the kind built on genuine mutual recognition, on the particular pleasure of being understood by someone who does not need you to explain yourself. He had been capable of this, despite everything in his nature that made sustained human connection difficult, despite the sensitivity and the isolation and the way his mind moved through problems at a speed that left most people unable to fully follow. Mark Twain had followed. Their friendship, which began in the 1890s when both men were at their respective peaks, was one of the genuine warmths of Tesla's adult life. Twain came to his laboratory. He was fascinated by the equipment, by the lightning, by the quality of attention Tesla brought to everything he did. He sat in the electrical chair and let Tesla run current through him and laughed. He was one of the few people who could make Tesla laugh in return. Their correspondence, portions of which survive, has the ease of two people who have found in each other something they do not find easily anywhere else: a recognition, a shared frequency. Twain died in 1910. Tesla wrote about the loss in terms that do not read like the conventional expressions of grief that people produce for public consumption. They read like someone describing a specific absence in a specific place, the way the room is different without the person in it. He had been to Twain's house many times. He knew the particular quality of the air in rooms where Twain had lived and thought and written. That quality was different now. There had been others, Robert Underwood Johnson, the poet and diplomat, whose house on Madison Avenue had been a gathering place for artists and scientists and writers in the years when Tesla was being celebrated by all three communities. His wife, Katherine Johnson, who wrote Tesla letters that his biographers have examined with careful attention, because their warmth sometimes edges into something more complicated, something that the Victorian context both enabled and constrained, something Tesla did not pursue and did not discourage, and perhaps did not fully understand. The friendships at that house had been real and had mattered and had faded, as all the friendships of that era faded, through death and distance and the slow drift of lives moving in different directions. Rudyard Kipling, Joseph Jefferson, Richard Watson Gilder, inventor, novelist, poet, and publisher. A world he had inhabited and from which he had gradually receded as the world itself changed and the people in it died or aged away from the places where those friendships had lived. By the 1920s, when Tesla was in his mid-60s and the Hotel New Yorker had become his permanent address by arrangement rather than by choice, the world he had known as a peer was largely gone. The world that had replaced it was younger and faster and less interested in the courtesies that had organized the social life of the previous century, less willing to sit quietly in the presence of a long story when the radio was inventing ways to fill every silence with noise. He was not bitter about this, or rather, he was not simply bitter, which is the simpler story. He was something more complex than bitter. He was a man who had spent his entire life oriented toward the future, who had always been working towards something that did not yet exist, and who was now old in a future that had arrived but was not the future he had been working toward. He was living in the consequence of his own work, and the consequence was not what the work had been for. Every electrical device in New York ran on his system. Every motor, every generator, every transformer, stepping up current at one end and stepping it down at the other end, with the elegant efficiency that his mathematical understanding of alternating current had made possible. The city he had come to in 1884 with 4 cents in his pocket was now comprehensively wired with his invention, and it hummed around him constantly, this enormous manifestation of what his mind had produced. Lit up every night in a display that the Chicago World's Fair had been a modest rehearsal for. He could not pay his hotel bill. This fact sits in the biography of Nikola Tesla, with the particular weight of things that are true and resist every attempt to resolve them into something more comfortable. It is not a paradox in the technical sense. There is a straightforward explanation involving royalties relinquished and investments lost, and the systematic financial exploitation of someone who was never equipped to defend himself against it, and who did not believe that defending himself against it was the appropriate use of his attention. The explanation is available. It does not make the fact any easier to sit with. He still worked. The patents continued accumulating well into the 1920s. The bladeless turbine, which used boundary layer effects to achieve rotation with remarkable efficiency and almost no mechanical complexity, was a genuinely elegant piece of engineering that found limited commercial application in his lifetime, but would be recognized later as an innovation ahead of its practical moment. The vertical takeoff aircraft design, filed as patents and described in technical papers, anticipated technologies that would not be built for decades. The magnifying transmitter work from Colorado continued to evolve in his mind even without a laboratory large enough to properly test it. And then there was the Teleforce. He called it the Teleforce. The newspapers, with the enthusiasm for the dramatic that he had long since stopped trying to moderate, called it the Death Ray. He did not like this name. He said so consistently in the interviews he gave on his birthdays and occasionally between them, the interviews that had become one of the primary mechanisms by which he remained visible to a world that would otherwise have been content to remember him in the past tense. What the teleforce actually was, what it actually could do, and what Tesla actually had in terms of experimental confirmation of his claims about it, are questions that the historical record answers only partially, and that became considerably more complicated by what happened to his papers after he died. He described it as a beam weapon. He described it as capable of projecting concentrated energy at a distance sufficient to bring down aircraft, to disable machinery, to create what he called a wall of power that no army could cross. He described it in terms that sounded, to the journalists covering his birthday statements, like the kind of thing a man who had once stood inside his own lightning might say, extraordinary in the way that Tesla had always been extraordinary, untethered from the practical constraints that limited other inventors. Whether this was so, whether the teleforce was real science being pursued in notebooks in room 3327, or was a man maintaining his public relevance with claims he could not fully substantiate, or was something in between, something real in principle and speculative in specifics. This is a question that the people who would have been best positioned to answer it made sure could not be definitively answered, because the FBI was watching. Not casually, not as a matter of routine monitoring of an elderly scientist with unconventional ideas, actively, with the specific interest of people who believe that what they are watching may be genuinely significant, who are trying to determine whether the man in room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker actually has what he says he has, or has something adjacent to it, or has something that, even in fragmentary and incomplete form, might be worth examining. The Bureau had a file on him. The file exists, portions of it declassified in subsequent decades, and it reveals an interest that goes beyond the standard surveillance of foreign-born individuals during periods of heightened national security concern, which was the category under which Tesla nominally fell, being Serbian-born and therefore technically a citizen of a foreign nation. The interest was technical. The agents assigned to monitor him were trying to understand the teleforce, trying to determine whether the particle beam weapon he described was scientifically plausible, trying to assess whether the notebooks he kept in his hotel room contained information that had strategic value. They could not get into the room easily. He was not a man who left his door unlocked. He was also not entirely unaware that he was being watched. He had always been perceptive in ways that surprised people who expected a man so absorbed in technical problems to be oblivious to the social and political dynamics around him. He understood that the government was interested. He understood that the interest was not entirely benign. He had proposals in the final years to sell the teleforce to the United States government, and separately to any government that would fund its development, proposals that were considered and declined, and that produced a paper trail suggesting the people doing the considering were not entirely certain what they were declining. His 87th birthday in July of 1943 was the last public occasion of his life. Reporters came as they always came, because the story of Tesla's birthday was by now a reliable annual feature, the aging wizard in the hotel room making his statements and allowing the photographers their photographs and sending them away with something to fill the column inches. He was frail by then, visibly so. The body that had driven itself through the superhuman working schedules of Graz and Colorado, and the New York laboratories finally arriving at the place that bodies arrive at when they have been used the way Tesla had used his. He told the reporters about the teleforce. He told them he had made a discovery more important than the AC motor. He told them things that they wrote down and published, and that were read with the mixture of fascination and gentle skepticism that had come to accompany Tesla's birthday announcements. The particular tone that says we are listening but we are not entirely sure, we believe. Then he went back inside. The pigeons came to the window ledge as they always did. He fed them. The one he had loved most was gone, had been gone for some years by then, and the loss had not diminished in the way that he had perhaps hoped losses diminished with time. It had simply become part of the texture of the room. part of what room 3327 was. This space that contained his papers and his equipment and his notebooks and the specific quality of absence that a life spent giving things away creates in the place where the giver finally rests. Outside, the city ran on what he had built. Inside, he worked. Still. Even now, he wrote in notebooks that he kept in careful stacks, the handwriting changed by age, but still precise, still the handwriting of a man who believed that what he was setting down was worth the care of being set down correctly. The notebooks contained calculations and observations and design sketches and the record of a mind that was still moving, still finding problems worth solving, still operating at a remove from the world that produced its results, rather than explaining its methods. He did not know, sitting in room 3327 in the autumn and winter of 1942 and into the first days of January 1943, that the weeks were narrowing. Or perhaps he did know, in the way that bodies communicate their states to the minds that inhabit them, and simply did not regard it as the primary matter requiring his attention. The primary matter requiring his attention was the work. It was always the work. It had always been the work. The motor in the Budapest park, the generator in the Colorado laboratory, the tower in the Long Island landscape. And now whatever this was, whatever these final notebooks contained, whatever problem he was still turning over in the interior theatre that had been running since Smiljan, since the waterfall and the library and the visions in the dark, something was still turning, right up until the end. The end, when it came, was quiet in the way that the ends of great storms are quiet. The enormous energy spent, the air cleared, the particular stillness that follows something that has been moving and generating and illuminating and crackling with force for 86 years. Quiet. Room 3327. January 7th, 1943. The Hotel New Yorker stood at 8th Avenue and 34th Street. 43 stories of Art Deco limestone and brick, one of the largest hotels in the world when it opened in 1930. The kind of building that announced itself against the Manhattan skyline with the particular confidence of something built in a decade that still believed in grand gestures. It had its own power plant in the basement. This detail is not incidental. The hotel generated its own electricity, ran its own systems, supplied its own light and heat, and the mechanisms that moved people between its floors. The engineers who built it had designed the electrical infrastructure with a care that the people staying on the upper floors were never required to think about, which is precisely how good infrastructure works. It is invisible when it functions. It becomes visible only in its absence. The electrical system in the basement of the Hotel New Yorker ran on alternating current. It ran on Nikola Tesla's system. He had been living on the 33rd floor since the early 1930s, in room 3327, by the arrangement with management that had been the practical basis of his residence for years. The hotel had concluded, by whatever calculus large institutions use when they make these decisions, that having Nikola Tesla as a resident was worth something that did not convert simply into the monetary terms of a standard occupancy agreement. He was part of what the hotel was. His presence meant something. The engineers who maintained the building's electrical systems knew whose principles made those systems run, and that knowledge lived in the building in a quiet way, unremarked but present. He had not been seen in several days. This was not entirely unusual. He had grown more reclusive as his 80s advanced, more reluctant to leave the room for anything that did not require leaving, more absorbed in whatever the notebooks and the calculations and the interior life of room 3327 contained. The staff knew to leave him largely alone. He had made this preference clear over years of residence, not rudely because he was not a rude man in the conventional sense, but with the particular firmness of someone who has learned that the alternative to clarity about what you need is a constant negotiation with people who mean well and cannot read the cost of their well-meaning interruptions. He had left instructions that he was not to be disturbed. The maid assigned to his floor followed these instructions through the days following the 5th of January, 1943. She noted the do not disturb indication on his door. She moved through her other rooms. She came back the next day and the day after that, and the door told her the same thing, and she respected it. On the evening of January 7th, something shifted in her assessment of the situation. She knocked. There was no answer. She opened the door. The room was dim. The light that came through the windows from the city outside was the particular ambient glow of New York at night, sourceless and general, the accumulated light of millions of bulbs burning in millions of rooms in a city that did not sleep. It fell across the furniture, across the stacks of papers on the desk, across the notebooks arranged with the care that Tesla brought to the arrangement of things that mattered to him. He was in the bed. His hands were folded. His face was still. The expression was the expression that faces settle into after the work of expression is no longer required. The blankness that is not emptiness, but simply the absence of animation. The face without the person in it. She understood immediately. She went to find someone. What happened next is documented partially in records that have been available in varying degrees of completeness since the decades following his death. And it is important to describe it accurately rather than in the terms that the more dramatic retellings have sometimes applied to it, because the accurate version is strange enough and disturbing enough without the embellishments that drama requires. The hotel management was notified, the appropriate calls were made, the medical examiner's office was contacted. These were the standard procedures carried out in the standard sequence, and they took the standard time, which is to say that for a period of hours, the room contained only what it had contained when the maid found it. Then the Office of Alien Property arrived. This is where the standard sequence became something else. The Office of Alien Property was a wartime institution, created to manage the assets of foreign nationals whose property might have value to the United States government during a period of active conflict. Its involvement in the affairs of a deceased resident of a Manhattan hotel was not in itself extraordinary. Tesla had been born in what was by 1943 the German-occupied territory of Yugoslavia. He was technically the citizen of a foreign power, however nominal that citizenship had become over his 6 decades of American residence. The legal framework for the office's involvement existed. What the office did in room 3327 went beyond what that legal framework strictly required. They took everything. The notebooks, there were many of them, accumulated across decades of work, filled with the handwriting that had changed from the precise, elegant script of his younger years to the slightly looser but still methodical notation of old age. They contained calculations, observations, the record of a mind that had been working continuously for 60 years on problems that ranged from electrical engineering to cosmology to weapons systems to the behavior of matter under conditions that most laboratories were not equipped to study. The papers, the loose documents, the correspondence, the technical drafts, the materials that had been organized in the stacks on the desk and in the boxes that lined the walls, the accumulation of a lifetime of thought set down on paper because the mind that produced it believed that what it was setting down was worth the care of being set down carefully. The physical models and equipment, the devices that Tesla had built or had constructed to his specifications, the components of experiments that he had been running in the limited space the hotel room allowed, the physical objects that translated between the world of the notebooks and the world of actual matter. All of it. Within hours of the discovery of his body, the room that had contained Nikola Tesla's working life for more than a decade was empty of everything that had made it his. An agent from the Office of Alien Property consulted in assessing the technical contents of what had been seized. An MIT professor named John Trump. Trump examined the materials and produced a report concluding that there was nothing in them of direct practical significance to the war effort or to national security. The report described Tesla's theoretical work as primarily speculative, as the product of an imaginative but not practically grounded mind, as the kind of thing that might be interesting historically but was unlikely to yield operational military applications. This report has been discussed extensively in the decades since it was produced, with varying degrees of credulity. Those who take it at face value point out that Trump was a serious scientist with no particular motive for concealing anything that genuinely threatened national security. that his assessment was professionally rendered and technically informed, and that the subsequent history of the seized materials does not obviously suggest that they contained anything that was operationally deployed. Those who do not take it entirely at face value point out that the teleforce, the particle beam weapon that Tesla had described in his final years, was a concept that at least some government scientists considered worth investigating, that the FBI's interest in Tesla during his lifetime had been considerably more than casual, that the level of urgency with which the materials were removed from room 3327 seems disproportionate to what the subsequent official account claims they contained, and that the history of government handling of sensitive technical materials in wartime does not inspire unconditional confidence in the completeness of official assessments. Both positions are still held. Neither has been definitively settled. What is known is that most of the materials eventually made their way through various channels and over various decades to the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade, where they were transferred to Yugoslavia as part of the settlement of his estate. Substantial portions of the collection are available to researchers. The notebooks have been examined by serious scientists and historians who have produced serious assessments of their contents. What the official position maintains was not in the seized materials may not have been in them, or it may have been in them, and the assessment was accurate, and the urgency was precautionary rather than revelatory. Or there is a third possibility, which is the one that tends to produce the most sustained discomfort when it is looked at directly, that what was in those materials was not a complete weapon system, not a death ray ready for operational deployment, but something more diffuse, and in some ways more significant, the record of a mind that had been working for 60 years on a coherent set of problems about the nature of energy and its transmission, problems that had produced the AC motor and the transformer, and the Colorado experiments, and the Wardenclyffe design, and the particle beam research as successive stages of the same inquiry, that the notebooks read as a whole, rather than as isolated technical documents, might reveal not a single weapon, but a direction, a way of thinking about energy and matter and their relationships that the people who seized the materials were, for whatever reason, not prepared to leave in public circulation. This cannot be confirmed, it can also not be dismissed. What can be confirmed is what was found in the room itself, in the physical space after the papers and notebooks and equipment had been removed. A bed, neatly made, a desk cleared, the standard furniture of a hotel room, impersonal and interchangeable, the kind of room that has housed thousands of different people and retains nothing particular about any of them once they are gone. On the windowsill, traces of birdseed. On the desk, one item that the agents had apparently considered below the threshold of significance and left behind. A photograph, small, somewhat worn at the edges, the black and white image of a woman who had been photographed sometime in the early decades of the century, who was looking at the camera with the expression of someone who does not entirely trust the device recording them. Whether this was the photograph that Tesla had kept near him in his final years is not documented with certainty. Whether it was connected to anyone specific, whether it was a portrait of someone he had known, or simply an image he had found somewhere, is not established in any record that has been made public. It was left behind. Everything that the government considered worth taking had been taken. What remained was the room, the seed on the sill, the city outside the window, lit up against the January darkness with a light that did not know it was his, that had never been told and did not require telling, that simply burned on with the steady, indifferent, magnificent persistence of something that has been given to the world and cannot be ungiven. He had given it. In a park in Budapest, 60 years before, he had drawn it in the dirt, and it was still burning. Every light in New York, every light in America, every light in the world that ran on his system, which by 1943 was most of it. The entire glowing human civilization that had wired itself with his invention and run its motors with his rotating magnetic field and stepped its current up and down through his transformers and built its hospitals and its factories and its homes on the foundation of what his mind had produced in a park in Hungary when he was 25 years old. All of it, still burning. He was gone, and it was still burning, and it would go on burning. That is what he had left behind, underneath the papers and the notebooks and the theories and the tower and the dream. That is what could not be seized and stored in a government facility and assessed by a professor from MIT and determined to have no direct practical significance to the war effort. The light itself, still on, still his. Tonight, somewhere between waking and sleep, consider what is running in the walls around you, the current moving through the wiring of this building, or this home, or this room, the invisible force that is powering whatever light you left on in the other room, the one you forgot to turn off, the one that is casting its pale rectangle under the door right now, the motor running in the refrigerator down the hall, the transformer somewhere outside converting voltage into the form you can use, the whole enormous invisible architecture of power that surrounds you so completely and so continuously that you have stopped noticing it, the way you have stopped noticing the air. All of it is his, not in the proprietary sense, not in the sense that his name is on it, or his estate collects a percentage, or any institution acknowledges the debt in the formal terms that institutions use to acknowledge debts. In the deeper sense, the sense in which a thing belongs to the person who first saw it, who carried it through years of doubt and dismissal and betrayal, and kept it intact in the interior space of their extraordinary mind until the world was finally ready to receive it. He saw it in a park in Budapest in the winter of 1882, a man 25 years old, standing in the fading light, drawing in the dirt with a stick, a rotating magnetic field, the principle that everything you are surrounded by tonight runs on. He carried it through a ditch in New York, through 2 betrayals, through a war he won, through a tower they dynamited, through 30 years in a hotel room with pigeons on the windowsill and notebooks on the desk, and a city humming 800 feet below with the system his mind had produced. He gave it away. He gave all of it away. The motor, the transformer, the AC system, the Chicago lights, the Niagara power, all of it. He gave Westinghouse back his royalties when Westinghouse needed the money, surrendering the income that would have sustained him, because sustaining the dream mattered more than sustaining himself. He tried to give the world the tower. He tried to give the world free energy, and they asked where he planned to put the meter, and when he could not answer in the terms the question required, they took the tower down. He never asked for anything back. This is the thing about him that does not reduce to a simple lesson. The Romantics want it to mean that generosity is its own reward, that the giver receives something invisible and sufficient in return for what they give. The Pragmatists want it to mean that he was naive, that he lacked the protective self-interest that survival requires, that his life was a cautionary tale about the relationship between genius and commerce. Both of these readings are available. Neither is complete, because the question his life keeps asking is not whether he should have protected himself better. The question is what we owe the people who build the world we live in, not in the abstract. Specifically, tonight, in the light that is still on in the other room, in the motor running in the wall, in every hospital that is lit right now through the night, keeping someone alive, in every city that is glowing against the darkness, the way Chicago glowed in the summer of 1893, in every screen and every charge and every device drawing power from a system that a man designed in the dirt of a park in Hungary and carried across an ocean with 4 cents in his pocket. What do we owe that? The question does not resolve. It is not supposed to resolve. It is the kind of question that asks to be held rather than answered, turned over slowly in the space between waking and not waking, considered from different angles without the pressure to arrive somewhere. He was born during the lightning storm in a village that barely exists on most maps. He died in a hotel room in the city he had lit, in the building powered by his system, watched by government agents who were not entirely certain what they were looking at, but were certain enough to take it all before anyone else could see. Between those 2 points, he drew the rotating magnetic field in the dirt of a park, stood inside his own artificial lightning in the Colorado dark-lit 100,000 bulbs in Chicago in a single night, designed a tower that was supposed to give everyone on Earth free power, and described wireless global communication in 1901. And both of those things are now so ordinary that you are probably using one of them to listen to this. He predicted the smartphone. He predicted wireless communication. He predicted the technology that moves the air in the building you are in right now, and the motor in the car, and the transmission system that carried the power to both of them from somewhere far away. He did not live to see any of it become ordinary. He did not live to see his name become the name of a car company worth more than any other car company on Earth, built on an electrical system built on his principles, named for him in a gesture of acknowledgement that came 80 years too late to matter to him personally. But that means that his name is now moving along the highways of the world inside machines that carry it the way he always wanted energy to be carried, freely, without a meter, just moving. He was a man from a village in a lightning storm who looked at a waterfall when he was 10 years old and saw that the force of it was going to waste, and never stopped thinking about that waste for the rest of his life, and built most of the modern world trying to correct it. He was also a man who fed pigeons in Bryant Park every day and loved one of them with a completeness that he had rarely been able to direct toward people, and carried that loss quietly, privately, in the room with the notebooks and the papers and the calculations that no one was supposed to see. Both of these things are true simultaneously. They do not resolve each other. He does not reduce to the tragedy or the triumph. He was the man who lit the world and the man who died in the dark. And both of those sentences are true of the same person, and the gap between them is where the actual story lives, the gap that all these hours have been trying to describe. Whether we failed him, or whether he failed himself, or whether the question of failure is the wrong question entirely, whether a life spent giving things to people who did not fully understand what they were receiving is a tragedy or the purest possible form of purpose, whether the tower mattered more in its standing or in its falling, whether the pigeon mattered, whether any of it means what we want it to mean or only what it was. These questions do not resolve tonight. They are not supposed to. They are the questions that belong to the space you are drifting into now, the space where the mind loosens its grip on the need for answers and lets the questions float. Let them float. Let the current run in the walls around you. Let the motor turn. Let the light that is still on somewhere burn on the way it has been burning since 1893, since Chicago, since a man stood in the center of his own lightning and offered the world something it did not know yet how to hold. It is still burning. You are inside it right now. Nikola Tesla lived 86 years, held the rotating magnetic field in his mind for 60 of them, gave the modern world its electrical system, designed a tower to give everyone on Earth free energy, watched the tower come down, fed pigeons in a park in Manhattan, wrote in notebooks that were seized before they were cold, died in a hotel room powered by his own invention, and left behind a light that has not gone out. That is what happened. What it means is still being decided. Sleep well.